A crown glitters, a whisper echoes, and history forgets, on purpose. For every throne won, there's a secret buried, missing bones, vanished heirs, locked doors behind velvet curtains. From medieval murders to modern cover-ups, the English monarchy is a palace of riddles wearing a smile. These aren't fairy tales. They're real, documented, and still unsolved. 25 mysteries. Centuries of silence. And the scholars still can't agree. So tonight, draw the curtains, dim the lights, and follow the trail they tried to erase. This is Top 25 English Royal Mysteries that still shock scholars. And none of them end with happily ever after. Before we dive in, if stories like this keep you up at night, hit that subscribe button so you don't miss what they don't want remembered. And while you're here, tell us in the comments, where in the world are you watching from? And what time is it right now? We're guessing it's later than you planned, and it's only going to get stranger from here. 1. The Fate of the Princes in the Tower, Edward V and Richard, Duke of York. In the spring of 1483, England discovered a peculiar truth about power. It does not like children, especially not royal ones, especially not when they are inconvenient. At the center of this discomfort stood two boys, one 12, one 9, who technically owned a kingdom they were not yet allowed to touch. Edward V, freshly proclaimed king but never crowned, and his younger brother Richard, Duke of York, spare heir, living insurance policy, human contingency plan. They were sons of Edward IV, products of a violent civil war that taught England one enduring lesson. If you leave a rival alive, history will charge interest. The boys were taken to the Tower of London, a place that insisted, politely, that it was not a prison. It was a residence, a royal apartment, a stronghold, a comforting stone womb with a habit of swallowing people whole and forgetting where it put them. At first everything looked routine. Edward V was seen, acknowledged, paraded just enough to make the transition feel lawful. Uncles bowed, councils convened, letters were signed, and then, quietly, the boys were seen less. Then not at all. Like candles blown out by someone who didn't want the room too bright. England noticed. Chroniclers noticed. Foreign ambassadors noticed. Mothers noticed. And yet, nothing happened. No announcement. No funeral. No public mourning. Just absence. The most dangerous thing a royal child can become. Officially, no one said the boys were dead, which is important. Because in politics, silence is not a void. It's a strategy. Their uncle, Richard III, soon took the crown for himself, citing legal complications that conveniently declared his nephews illegitimate. The justification leaned on paperwork few had seen and witnesses who were no longer alive to object. England shrugged in the way only a country exhausted by decades of war can shrug. Did Richard order their deaths? The question has followed him like a shadow with opinions. Tudor writers, employed, rewarded, and very much alive thanks to Richard's defeat, were happy to answer yes, with flair, with drama, with moral certainty sharpened into narrative weaponry. Later historians softened the tone but not the suspicion. Richard had motive, he had opportunity, he had custody. He also had a reputation, earned or assigned, for efficiency, and the boys never reappeared. But history is rarely so tidy. There was no death warrant, no execution record, no paid assassin caught with a guilty conscience and a loose tongue, no tower confession, not even a reliable witness who claimed to have seen bodies removed under moonlight. Just rumor. Later rumor. And rumor written down decades after the fact, once it was politically safe to remember things a certain way. Which is where doubt creeps in. Not loudly but persistently, like water finding cracks. Some scholars argue the murders, if they happened, may not have been Richard's doing at all. After all, if Richard wanted them gone, why the secrecy? Public executions had never troubled medieval monarchs before. A clean narrative was often safer than a lingering mystery. And yet here we have one of the greatest unresolved silences in English history. Others suggest the boys were killed later, after Richard fell, by Henry VII, the man who benefited most from their permanent absence. Henry had spent years building legitimacy from thin air. 2 living Yorkist heirs would have been a problem he couldn't charm, marry, or legislate away. And then there is the most unsettling possibility of all, that one or both boys survived. Not survived triumphantly, not escaped heroically, but endured, hidden, relocated, quietly erased into anonymity by people who believed disappearance was mercy. This theory refuses to die because the era made identity flexible. Faces changed with age, names changed with borders, and documents were only as truthful as the hands that held the quill. Pretenders emerged decades later claiming to be one of the lost princes, and while most historians roll their eyes, contemporaries didn't always. Kings don't fund imposters unless the rumor has legs. What makes the mystery especially cruel is how little the boys themselves matter in the surviving evidence. They are spoken about, never speaking. Described, never describing. Their fate is inferred from politics rather than humanity. Even their deaths, if they happened, are discussed as administrative problems. 2 children reduced to a footnote because footnotes are safer than funerals. And then there's the tower itself, a structure with too much memory and not enough honesty. Records from the period are incomplete, lost, or suspiciously vague. Renovations occurred. Walls were opened. Bones were moved. The tower, like history, was renovated by those in power. Every theory collapses under the same weight. There is no single piece of evidence that closes the case. Only accumulations of likelihoods. Only probability shaped by who benefited most from silence. Which leaves historians with an uncomfortable truth. Certainty would be easier, but uncertainty is more accurate. If Richard ordered the deaths, he left no receipt. If Henry ensured they never returned, he erased the trail. If they survived, they did so quietly enough to avoid leaving proof of life stronger than rumor. And rumor, infuriatingly, is not evidence, but it is not nothing either. The princes in the tower haunt English history not because they were murdered, but because they were unresolved. They exist in a suspended state, neither alive nor officially dead, caught between legal arguments and moral accusations. They are the embodiment of a question England never answered. What happens when power inherits children before it inherits truth? And just when you think the story ends there, with 2 boys swallowed by stone and politics, history does something cruelly theatrical. Nearly 2 centuries later, workers digging inside the tower uncover a small wooden box. Inside it, bones, child-sized, carefully placed, and quietly, reverently, transferred to Westminster Abbey as if the mystery had finally decided to cooperate. Except it didn't, because identifying the princes turned out to be far easier than proving it. And once bones enter the story, silence becomes louder, arguments sharper, and the question more dangerous than ever. After all, if those bones really belonged to the princes, then the tower wasn't just a place where they vanished, it was where they ended, and England buried the evidence in plain sight. 2. Are the princes buried in Westminster Abbey? In 1674, nearly 200 years after the princes vanished from the Tower of London, a group of workmen dismantling a staircase stumbled upon something that should not have been there. A small wooden box, unmarked, sealed, buried deep in the stonework. Inside were the bones of 2 children. The tower, of course, had many secrets by then. It always has. But bones have a way of commanding silence. And in this case, that silence was quickly filled by a theory so convenient it practically wrote itself. These were the lost princes, Edward V and Richard, Duke of York. The same boys who had vanished without public explanation decades before the Tudors took over and rewrote the rulebook on royal legitimacy. The bones were examined, briefly, hastily, and then, in what might be the most polite cover-up in British history, they were placed in an urn and transferred to Westminster Abbey. A plaque was added, a tomb was constructed, and just like that, the mystery seemed solved. Except it wasn't. It still isn't. Because if you were hoping for a neat ending, you've come to the wrong monarchy. Let's begin with the obvious. The identification was based on little more than assumption. There was no forensic testing, no effort to match age, gender, or lineage, just the location, inside the tower, the number of skeletons, 2, and the country's aching desire to close the book on a story that had grown far too uncomfortable. Of course, in the 17th century, science was more alchemy than accuracy. The idea of DNA testing, or even modern osteological analysis, was centuries away. So the identification relied on symbolism. 2 young skeletons in a place that symbolized royal disappearance. Coincidence? Maybe, or maybe narrative convenience. By the 20th century, the question of the bones had evolved from folklore to forensic puzzle. In 1933, they were re-examined in a limited capacity, still without modern tools, but with greater attention to anatomy. The findings? Vague, inconclusive. One skeleton may have been older than the other. One may have had dental features inconsistent with a 9-year-old, but again, May is doing most of the work here. There was no definitive match, no smoking femur. The British royal establishment, for its part, has been remarkably consistent in its reluctance to test the remains further. Requests for DNA analysis have been raised multiple times, particularly in the 1990s and 2000s, and consistently denied. The rationale? Respect for the dead, preservation of sacred burial ground, a distaste for digging up the past, literally and figuratively. But for critics and scholars, the refusal looks less like reverence and more like strategic ambiguity. After all, what if the test proved the bones aren't the prince's? That would mean England buried 2 children under the wrong names. It would mean the real fate of the princes remains unknown. It would mean centuries of historical storytelling, art, literature, museum exhibitions are built on a mistake dressed up as closure. And worse, it might reignite questions about guilt. Because if these bones aren't the prince's, then the story isn't just unresolved, it's actively misleading, which leads to the most uncomfortable possibility of all. The real bodies were never found because they were never meant to be. Let's imagine for a moment that the bones in Westminster Abbey are not those of Edward and Richard. Then who are they? One theory suggests they may have been the children of tower staff or victims of a previous internment. The tower has served many functions: fortress, palace, prison, execution site, and occasionally, mass grave. It's not absurd to think other children may have died within its walls, either through violence or illness, especially during periods of upheaval or siege. Another possibility? The bones are a mix, misassembled, confused. Unrelated individuals, buried together through carelessness or concealment. After all, in the chaos of the English Civil War and Restoration, bones were frequently moved, disturbed, and lost. Order was often a reconstruction, not a reflection. And then there's the third possibility, the one that really tightens the narrative noose. The bones were planted, not necessarily as a sinister plot, but as a tidy solution. A way to give the country something to believe in. Because belief is powerful. Belief fills gaps that facts leave behind. Belief lets us say, "Here lies Edward V and Richard of York," even when we cannot prove it. It's the same belief that lets us pretend history has an answer for everything, even when all it has is a guess. Yet the strangest part of all this isn't the uncertainty. It's the fact that no one seems eager to solve it. You might assume historians and monarchists alike would want to know the truth. But truth, as always, comes with risk. And in this case, that risk extends far beyond 2 children and a box of bones. Because if DNA testing were allowed, and if the results contradicted the traditional story, a Pandora's box of implications would open. What does it say about Richard III, now partially rehabilitated by modern scholars and public campaigns. What does it say about Henry VII, who staked his dynasty's legitimacy on a lie he might have buried deeper than anyone imagined? And most provocatively, what does it say about us, the living audience still hooked on this centuries-old whodunit? We're not just debating a historical crime. We're confronting our own appetite for narrative closure. We want the princes to be buried at Westminster Abbey because that ending feels cleaner. It gives us a tomb to point to, a stone to visit, a story that fits on a placard. And yet, that desire is what keeps the truth buried deeper than the bones ever were. Because testing them might end the mystery, but it also might not. Even if the bones matched the princes, that wouldn't reveal how they died, or who killed them, or why their deaths were hidden. All it would prove is that their remains ended up in a wooden box, under a staircase, waiting to be found by workers who were probably just trying to finish their shift and go home. And maybe that's the cruel irony. Even if we confirm their identities, we still wouldn't have a resolution. Just another layer of ambiguity, dressed up in genetic science and museum lighting. Which is why this question, are the princes buried in Westminster Abbey, remains unanswered. Not because we lack the tools, but because we fear the consequences of the answer. It's not just about bones. It's about power, legacy, and what happens when you start asking questions that history isn't ready to answer. And so, the urn stays sealed. The tomb remains labeled. Tourists walk by it every day, unaware that inside lies a question that has outlived empires. And just a few feet away, another story waits beneath the stone floor, about a different king. One whose death was no less mysterious, no less suspicious, and no less inconvenient for the brother who just happened to be standing nearby when the arrow flew. 2 mysteries down, 23 to go, and we're just getting started. If you're still here, that means your curiosity might be as incurable as ours. So take a second, hit that subscribe button, and let us know in the comments. Where are you tuning in from, and what time is it right now? Because if you're deep into royal conspiracies at 2 a.m., you're exactly where you belong. 3. The death of William II. Rufus, accident or assassination? If a king dies in a forest and no one provides a believable explanation, does the monarchy get nervous? On August 2nd, 1100, William II of England, known to his friends, and far more often his enemies, as Rufus, went out for a hunt. He never came back. An arrow pierced his chest somewhere in the New Forest. The man who fired it, a nobleman named Walter Tyrrell, was never tried, never even interrogated. He fled to France immediately. Fast, confident, and, one might say, suspiciously unbothered by royal guilt. At the time, people were told it was an accident, a tragic misfire. Just one of those regrettable things that happens when heavily armed nobles go galloping around the woods, shooting sharp objects for sport. And many accepted that story, for a while. But then something awkward happened. Henry, William's younger brother, just so happened to be in the vicinity, and he just so happened to ride straight to Winchester the moment his brother's body hit the forest floor. Within days, he had secured the royal treasury. Within weeks, he was crowned Henry I of England. Even in medieval politics, that's what you might call efficient. The death of William II sits in that uncomfortable twilight zone between plausibility and performance. On the one hand, hunting accidents were genuinely common in the 12th century. Equipment was crude, forests were chaotic, and monarchs weren't exactly known for safety protocols. On the other hand, this was a king, one whose death benefited his younger brother more than anyone else in England. And that's where the mystery grows teeth. William Rufus was not a beloved monarch. He ruled with an intensity that made barons nervous, bishops irritated, and chroniclers morally queasy. He had frequent disputes with the church, particularly with Anselm, the Archbishop of Canterbury, and was known for squeezing his nobles and clergy alike for every coin he could extract. His tax collectors made today's bureaucrats look like saints. His reign, in short, was secure, but unpopular. He was unmarried, without children, and without a designated heir. That alone made him a political target. To be a childless king in the 12th century was to be a loaded gun left on the table. And yet, William had survived worse than bad press. What makes his death linger in the shadowlands of conspiracy is not just the arrow, but the silence that followed. No royal inquest, no official investigation, no consequences. Walter Tyrrell, the alleged shooter, slipped away with shocking ease. It's not every day a man can kill a king and then emigrate without even a fine. Even by medieval standards, that sort of casual response strains belief. Later chroniclers, writing decades or even centuries after the fact, suggested that Henry may have known more than he ever admitted. That William's death wasn't just a hunting accident, but a carefully timed removal. These accounts are heavy on implication, light on proof, but they tap into a familiar discomfort. When politics and death overlap, it's rarely random. But here's where the story gets even more interesting. There is no direct evidence linking Henry to his brother's death. No confession, no recorded plot, no letter from a disgruntled baron saying, "Hey, by the way, we're killing the king next Thursday." Instead, what we have is behavior. Henry acted like a man who'd been preparing. He didn't mourn publicly. He didn't hesitate. He secured the treasury within hours and arranged for his coronation before William was even cold. That isn't guilt, per se, but it's not exactly innocence either. In medieval succession politics, opportunism wasn't a crime. It was a virtue. But even opportunists like to keep their hands clean. And that's the genius of a hunting accident. Plausible deniability wrapped in leaves and bark. The site of the incident, the New Forest, also adds an eerie layer to the narrative. Created by William the Conqueror, father to both William Rufus and Henry, the New Forest had a reputation even then. Local folklore claimed it was cursed. Several members of the royal family had met tragic ends within its borders. Some peasants believed the land itself rejected the Norman kings. Of course, that may be more superstition than strategy, but the symbolism wasn't lost on medieval chroniclers. They framed William's death as divine retribution, a morally suspect king brought low by celestial justice. That's convenient. It's also suspect. Divine justice is history's way of saying, we don't know what happened, but it probably served him right. The only eyewitness accounts come from chroniclers like Orderic Vitalis and William of Malmesbury, who wrote well after the event and were themselves not impartial observers. Their narratives blend piety, moralizing, and rumor into a stew that's long on drama but short on evidence. Orderic Vitalis, for instance, described William's death as a moment of judgment for his sins, emphasizing the impiety of his court and the alleged arrogance of the king. These weren't reports. They were sermons in narrative form. So what do we actually know? That a king was shot by an arrow while hunting. That the man blamed fled the country, never to be punished. That his brother seized the crown with what one might call professional haste. And that nobody, absolutely nobody, in a position to demand answers, ever bothered to do so. In the vacuum of facts, theories have bred like ivy on an old ruin. One theory argues that Walter Tyrrell was indeed the shooter, but that it was an accident, panicked and fatal, and that his flight was less guilt than fear. After all, kings have been known to punish even honest mistakes when the optics go bad. Another theory, darker and more durable, argues that Henry arranged the whole thing. Not necessarily by hiring Tyrrell to shoot his brother, but perhaps by creating conditions in which an accident was likely and accountability impossible. Think. Plausible deniability and chainmail. There's even the possibility of a third party. Nobles who saw William's death as a solution to multiple problems and decided to let nature or arrows take its course. The appeal of the mystery is that it refuses to pick a side. Like all good unsolved deaths, it leaves just enough ambiguity to keep all suspects at arm's length and all conclusions slightly slippery. But there's a deeper reason the story endures. William's death marks a pivotal moment in English history, not because of how he died, but because of what followed. Henry III's reign, while turbulent, laid key foundations for centralized governance, legal reform, and a dynastic strategy that would echo for generations. He seized the moment with the efficiency of a man who either got very lucky or knew exactly when to be in the right place with the right story. The problem is, history rarely hands out clean motives. It whispers them. Through behavior, through silence, through choices made quickly in the absence of accountability. And perhaps that's why William II's death still matters. It reminds us that sometimes, in the theater of monarchy, the curtain falls too fast, the lights stay dim, and the applause is suspiciously quiet. It reminds us that a hunting accident can kill a king, but only if the right people decide to call it one. And just when the forest seems still again, and the crown rests on another head, a different royal disappearance begins to tug at the seams of the historical record. This one involving not a king struck down, but a king quietly removed, a man unseated, imprisoned, and perhaps, just perhaps, still breathing long after the chronicles claimed otherwise. 4. What really happened to Edward II? To be a king in medieval England was to live under two constant threats: rebellion from without and betrayal from within. Edward II, son of the great Edward I and heir to one of the most iron-fisted legacies in English history, somehow managed to suffer both, simultaneously and spectacularly. His story, if told as a tragedy, would read almost too neat. A weak ruler, a storm of baronial discontent, a foreign-born favorite with too much power, a resentful wife with a new ally, and a crown that slipped from his head long before the official abdication ceremony. But history rarely behaves like literature. It forgets to tie off the final act. And in Edward II's case, it forgot to leave a body. Officially, Edward II died in 1327, in captivity, in a place called Berkeley Castle. His enemies said it was natural causes, or illness, or, when feeling more theatrical, divine justice. Later rumors added more dramatic flair. His enemies wanted him gone, after all, and nothing cleans up a regime quite like the death of the last king. But somewhere along the way, the story started to fray. Whispered reports emerged, strange documents surfaced, letters from abroad made subtle claims. Some insisted Edward hadn't died at all, that he had escaped, that he lived quietly in exile, that his death had been staged, an elaborate performance to cleanse the political stage while sparing the man. This possibility, once dismissed as wishful nonsense, has never quite gone away. Because the more scholars have looked into it, the stranger the whole affair begins to feel. Let's go back. Edward II's reign was one of contrasts and contradictions. He inherited a war machine from his father, Edward I, a conqueror king who spent his final years marching against the Scots, dominating Wales, and centralizing royal authority with brutal clarity. Edward II, by contrast, preferred music, art, intimate friendships, rustic pastimes. Where his father wielded a mace, Edward leaned on companionship. His deep favoritism toward certain courtiers, especially Piers Gaveston and later Hugh Despenser the Younger, earned him widespread distrust among the barons. Not necessarily because of moral judgments, but because of power. These men controlled access to the king, lands, and privileges, reshaping court politics around themselves. Edward, intentionally or not, sidelined the traditional nobility, and the nobility, in return, plotted. Eventually, it was too much. In 1326, his wife, Isabella of France, who had endured years of marginalization, allied herself with Roger Mortimer, a powerful Marcher lord. Together, they invaded England, deposed Edward, and seized control of the state in the name of Edward's teenage son, soon to be Edward III. What happened next is where the fog sets in. Edward II was imprisoned in Berkeley Castle. The conditions of his captivity remain vague. Reports claim he was treated poorly, but kept alive. Then, sometime in the fall of 1327, word emerged. The former king was dead. No autopsy, no public viewing, no burial attended by masses. Just gone. And while some contemporary sources accept this quietly, others raise eyebrows. Most of our knowledge comes from chronicles written years after the fact, often by writers who were far from neutral. The Vita Edwardi Secundi, an important source, cuts off just before Edward's death. Other accounts, such as those from chroniclers like Adam Miramuth, report the death as fact, but admit a suspicious lack of detail. One narrative claims Edward was buried at Gloucester Abbey, now Gloucester Cathedral, with appropriate royal ceremony. A tomb does exist. It's ornate, regal, visited. But, as with the princes in the Tower, a tomb is not proof of identity. In medieval politics, a burial was a statement, not an affidavit. The idea that Edward survived began as fringe whispering. But in the 19th and 20th centuries, historians began re-examining a curious document known as the Fieschi letter, a Latin letter dated around 1336, written by a Genoese priest named Manuel Fieschi to Edward III. The letter claims in some detail that Edward II escaped from Berkeley Castle with the help of sympathizers, that he fled to Corfe Castle, then to Ireland, and eventually across Europe, that he lived for several years in a hermitage near Milan under the protection of sympathetic nobles. The letter is careful, orderly, and oddly specific. Now, a single letter, even a detailed one, doesn't make a historical fact. Many scholars treat it as a forgery, a hoax, or a well-crafted fantasy designed to flatter the current king or manipulate court politics. But then, there are the foreign sightings. Unrelated letters and diplomatic accounts that mention a mysterious Englishman in monastic garb, a former king, a man some recognized. Too much for coincidence, too little for confirmation. Even the Pope got involved. A 1330 letter from Pope John XXII to an English noble refers obliquely to the fate of Edward II in terms that suggest uncertainty, not grief, not sanctification, but ambiguity. Edward III's own actions add to the confusion. After taking full control of the government in 1330, by overthrowing Mortimer and asserting his authority, he ordered honors and prayers for his father. A delayed gesture, an oddly timed memorial, and one that made some wonder, was this contrition for a man already dead, or for a man whose fate had finally been sealed? One popular theory suggests that Edward III, upon discovering the truth of his father's survival, chose silence, not out of cruelty, but out of strategy. A living ex-king was a risk, a symbol for rebellion, a complication for foreign policy, a fact too dangerous to acknowledge. So, if Edward II did survive and lived out his years in obscurity, then the story isn't just mysterious. It's almost operatic. A king dethroned, wandering across Europe in anonymity, not martyred, not celebrated, just forgotten on purpose. Of course, this scenario raises logistical questions. How could such a high-profile figure remain hidden? Who would support him? What proof exists beyond speculation? The answer, as usual, is frustrating. There's enough evidence to raise doubt, enough gaps to keep hope alive, but not enough to settle anything. And perhaps that's the real heart of the mystery. It's not about whether Edward died in 1327. It's about how we weigh silence against noise, how we measure political convenience against personal truth. If Edward died at Berkeley, then his story is one of downfall and humiliation. If he survived, then his life becomes something even more fascinating. An echo, a man who outlived his own relevance, a ghost in Europe, watching his son build an empire that would outshine his own. In both versions, he's a tragic figure, a king who didn't quite fit the mold, undone not by a single mistake, but by the slow accumulation of misalignments between temperament and expectation, between private desire and public duty. And just when you think Edward's tale has offered its last surprise, history twists the blade again. Because shortly after these rumors about his survival begin circulating, another royal legitimacy crisis rises from the ashes of his deposition. A claim that the next king, Edward III's father, was never valid to begin with, that before he married his queen, he may have made a binding promise to another woman, a pre-contract, they called it, and its implications would ripple across the Wars of the Roses like a legal time bomb no one could defuse. 5. Was Edward IV pre-contracted to Eleanor Butler? In the mid-1480s, as the Wars of the Roses limped toward their blood-stained conclusion, a new kind of ghost began to haunt the Plantagenet family tree. Not a murdered prince, not a vanished king, but a legal technicality with a name, Eleanor Butler. Or more precisely, Lady Eleanor Butler, daughter of a noble house, former lady-in-waiting, and, if you believe the documents put forward by Richard III, the rightful wife of Edward IV. The story broke like a court scandal whispered too loudly at a funeral. According to Richard's government and the statute known as titulus regius, Edward IV had, before marrying Elizabeth Woodville, made a binding promise of marriage, a pre-contract, to Eleanor. And under the laws of canon law, that meant his marriage to Elizabeth was invalid, which meant all their children were illegitimate, which meant young Edward V, declared king just weeks before, had no claim to the throne, which meant, rather conveniently, that Richard of Gloucester, the late king's brother, could now wear the crown himself without needing to draw too much blood, just a little ink. To this day, historians argue over whether the pre-contract was real, forged, misremembered, or politically engineered. And at the center of this debate stands not Eleanor Butler, who had died in 1468 long before the scandal erupted, but the vast vacuum of evidence she left behind. Let's start with the basics. Edward IV married Elizabeth Woodville in secret, sometime in 1464. That secrecy was not romantic. It was strategic, and possibly desperate. Elizabeth was a commoner, a widow, and not the kind of bride expected for a king of England. But Edward married her anyway, then revealed the union to his court, blindsiding his allies and undermining the diplomatic matches they had been arranging on his behalf. Still, he made it stick. For years, no one seriously challenged the marriage. Elizabeth was crowned queen. They had multiple children. Edward had mistresses, of course. This was the 15th century, but no one accused him of bigamy. Until he died. When Edward IV died suddenly in 1483, his son Edward V was just 12 years old. A regency was needed. That regency, according to Edward IV's wishes, was to be led by his brother Richard. But once Richard had the boy in custody, things began to move with unnerving speed. Suddenly, sermons were being preached claiming the young prince was illegitimate. Whispers filled London about a pre-contract with another woman. Then came the titulus regius, passed by Parliament, which spelled it out clearly. Edward IV had been pre-contracted to Eleanor Butler, making his later marriage to Elizabeth Woodville invalid, and all their children, in the eyes of the law, bastards, which neatly removed Edward V from the succession, which, by a remarkable coincidence, made Richard the rightful king. It was all terribly tidy, too tidy. There is no surviving document from Edward IV's lifetime referencing a pre-contract. No confession, no recorded testimony, no legal dispute. The evidence surfaced only after his death, and after Richard had control of both the heir and the capital. The chief witness was Robert Stillington, the Bishop of Bath and Wells, a figure who had once served Edward IV and now claimed to have been present when Edward pledged himself to Eleanor Butler. Stillington's motives have been questioned ever since. Was he telling the truth? Or was he providing Richard with a story that fit the political needs of the hour? After all, Eleanor had been dead for 15 years. She wasn't around to confirm or deny anything. Elizabeth Woodville had taken sanctuary and, under pressure, released her younger son Richard into the hands of his uncle. The public, confused and exhausted, had little reason or ability to challenge the legality of a royal statute. From a legal standpoint, canon law treated pre-contracts seriously. In some cases, a promise to marry, made in the presence of witnesses and with mutual consent, could be considered as binding as an actual marriage. But proving one required more than hearsay, especially when the stakes were a throne. So we're left with questions. If the pre-contract existed, why didn't Edward annul it before marrying Elizabeth? Why was it never brought up during his lifetime, despite the political chaos that often engulfed his court? Why did Stillington wait until the one man who could contradict him was dead? And if Edward's marriage to Elizabeth was truly invalid, why did so many members of the nobility continue to support her children's rights, until Richard's power made opposition dangerous? What makes this mystery so potent isn't just the uncertainty, it's the consequences. Because if Edward IV's children were illegitimate, then Richard III's seizure of the throne wasn't a coup. It was legal housekeeping. If the pre-contract was a lie, then Richard's reign began with a fraud so elegant it could only have come from someone deeply versed in both law and manipulation. The Tudors certainly thought so. When Henry VII defeated Richard at the Battle of Bosworth, he moved quickly to erase Titulus Regius from the record. The act was repealed, its copies ordered destroyed, and Elizabeth of York, Edward IV's eldest daughter, was married to Henry, uniting the feuding houses of York and Lancaster and shoring up Tudor legitimacy. But the stain of the pre-contract lingered. Its ghost haunted Tudor politics. It was whispered about in courts across Europe. It surfaced in the propaganda wars between Ricardians and Tudor loyalists. And in the 20th and 21st centuries, historians have dug into it again, debating whether Stillington's claim might have had some kernel of truth. After all, Edward IV was known for impulsive decisions, secret liaisons, and a tendency to charm women of noble birth. Eleanor Butler, widowed, young, connected, and reportedly attractive, would not have been an unusual choice for a youthful indiscretion. It's plausible, in theory, that he made a promise he later regretted. It's also plausible that such a promise was exaggerated or fabricated by Richard to serve a power grab cloaked in legal robes. And that's what makes this mystery so maddening. It exists in the realm of legal gray zones and political timing. The documents are gone. The witnesses are dead. The motivations are layered in self-preservation, ambition, and dynastic fear. We will likely never know what passed between Edward IV and Eleanor Butler, if anything. Their private histories have become public battlegrounds, their intentions overwritten by necessity. But the implications remain enormous. If the pre-contract was real, it means that Elizabeth Woodville was never a queen, that Edward V was never a king, that the entire Yorkist claim to the throne was flawed, that Richard III's actions were not treacherous but corrective. If it was a fabrication, it marks one of the most effective pieces of political misinformation in English royal history, an early masterclass in how to bend the law around ambition. Either way, the truth has vanished beneath layers of narrative, each one shaped by whoever needed the story to say something different. And just as that question begins to settle uneasily in the mind, another rises from the smoke of posthumous controversy. A boy claiming to be the very prince that Richard III had supposedly made disappear. A pretender, a political weapon, or perhaps something else. 6. Was Perkin Warbeck really Richard, Duke of York? In the late 1490s, an unfamiliar man walked into the stage lights of European politics and claimed he had a story to tell. It was a good one, a royal one, and if true, a deeply destabilizing one. He said he was Richard of Shrewsbury, the younger of the two princes in the Tower. The boy everyone assumed had vanished, possibly died, during the shadowy collapse of the House of York. Only he hadn't died, he claimed. He had escaped, hidden, survived, and now, after years in obscurity, he had returned to reclaim his birthright. The man was known to history as Perkin Warbeck, though he never used that name himself. He insisted he was not a cloth merchant's apprentice from Tournai, as the English crown claimed, but the legitimate son of Edward IV. And this wasn't just a tavern boast. Entire countries listened. Entire courts watched. Some even believed. In a Europe still haunted by the unsolved disappearance of the two princes, Warbeck's claim was not merely intriguing, it was plausible. Alarmingly so. The facts surrounding Warbeck's origins are, predictably, murky. According to the official Tudor version, he was born around 1474 to a Flemish family, spent his youth in the Low Countries, and picked up languages and manners while working for various merchants. Somewhere along the way, the story goes, he learned enough English and enough courtly behavior to convince some foreign courtiers that he was more than he appeared. But by 1490, he began introducing himself differently. Under the guidance, or manipulation, of pro-Yorkist factions abroad, Warbeck started claiming royal identity. He had, he said, been spirited away from the Tower in 1483 by loyal servants. The plan had been to hide him until it was safe to return. He had grown up in secrecy, kept moving, always under threat. Now, with the tyranny of Henry VII well underway, it was time for England to meet its rightful king. A dramatic story, yes. But the more disturbing fact is how many people believed it, or pretended to. He gained the recognition of Margaret of Burgundy, Edward IV's sister, who referred to him openly as her nephew. She claimed to recognize him, to know his mannerisms. If it was a performance, she committed to the role. Margaret's court even provided him with money, clothes, and training in royal deportment. Then came James IV of Scotland, who welcomed him, granted him a pension, and even married him off to one of his own distant relatives, Lady Catherine Gordon. Hardly the treatment one offers to an obvious impostor. In Ireland, where Yorkist loyalty ran deep, Warbeck was treated as a returning prince. In France and Flanders, his name was whispered as a symbol of Tudor illegitimacy. In Spain, ambassadors kept close watch, uncertain whether he might tip the balance in their delicate diplomacy with England. Even Maximilian I, the Holy Roman Emperor, entertained him as a political tool. All of this posed a growing problem for Henry VII, whose hold on the throne was less than 2 decades old and built on both victory and paperwork. He had claimed the crown not by inheritance but by conquest, at Bosworth, where Richard III died wearing it. Henry had married Elizabeth of York, Edward IV's daughter, to cement his legitimacy. But now, here was a man claiming to be Edward IV's son. Someone whose very existence threatened to unravel the dynasty before it fully began. So what did Henry do? He turned to one of the Tudor regime's favorite tools, narrative control. The royal propaganda machine labeled Warbeck a fraud, a wandering foreigner coached by disloyal rebels and foreign enemies. They mocked his background, questioned his manners, cast doubt on his accent, and described him as a play king. Henry worked to suppress rumors, silence dissenters, and execute those caught conspiring with the pretender. The threat wasn't just physical, it was symbolic. Yet for all his efforts, Warbeck's claim didn't fade easily. He landed in Cornwall in 1497, supported by local rebels angry over taxes and Tudor policies. Though the rebellion was swiftly put down, Warbeck's arrival in England, his physical presence on the island, sent ripples through the court. He was eventually captured and paraded through London, not as a prisoner of war, but as an object lesson. Henry had him publicly confessed to being an impostor. The confession, likely crafted by court officials, was detailed, theatrical, and importantly, self-incriminating. Warbeck was not tortured, at least not by medieval standards, but pressure, isolation, and threats of worse may have shaped his performance. Then, in an act of carefully staged mercy, Henry allowed Warbeck to live, for a time. He was kept at court under supervision, but in 1499, after allegedly conspiring with Edward, Earl of Warwick, another Yorkist with a dubious claim, he was executed, not as a king, not even as a political prisoner, but as a common criminal. And just like that, the problem disappeared. Or so it seemed. But the story refused to settle. Why did so many powerful people accept, support, or entertain Warbeck's claim? Were they simply using him as a pawn against England? Or did they see something in him? Some flicker of truth, some mannerism or detail too convincing to ignore? Even Margaret of Burgundy, whose political agenda was clear, had nothing material to gain from supporting an obvious fake. Her public recognition wasn't cautious. It was enthusiastic. She backed him financially and diplomatically. Either she was playing a deep political game, or she believed, or wanted to believe, that her brother's son had returned. And what of Warbeck himself? If he was merely a Flemish merchant's apprentice, he carried himself with remarkable poise for a man thrust into one of the most dangerous identity roles in Europe. He spoke like a noble, moved like a courtier, and held his composure under pressure. His confession, while official, raises eyebrows. It reads like a script, tailored to exonerate the Tudor state. Some historians question its authorship. Others point to inconsistencies. After all, if Warbeck was an impostor, why didn't Henry VII put him on trial and cross-examine him publicly? Why the quiet confession and the delayed execution? The deeper mystery may lie not in whether Perkin Warbeck was the real Richard, Duke of York, but in why that question still matters. Because if Warbeck was genuine, then the story of the Tudors begins with a lie. If he was not, then he was one of the most effective political decoys in European history, a man whose face launched rebellions, unsettled governments, and nearly reset the course of English monarchy. Either way, his presence speaks to the power of uncertainty. In a world without photography, without biometrics, without birth certificates, identity was a performance, and performances could be believed if staged well enough. Warbeck's legacy is not merely that he claimed to be someone else, but that for a time, others were willing to believe it, maybe even wanted to believe it. And so the mystery remained suspended, a man who might have been a prince, or might have been a plot, a footnote in Tudor history that keeps threatening to become the headline. And just when Henry VII thought he had silenced the ghosts of York, another death inside the Tower of London would revive the old question. When a king falls and a rival rises, is that death always natural, or just politically convenient? 7. The death of Henry VI. Quiet passing or political killing? In the spring of 1471, a strange quiet settled over England. It was the kind of quiet that follows a storm, the storm in this case being the Wars of the Roses, which had just entered one of its bloodiest chapters. The Yorkists had triumphed decisively. The Lancastrian army had been crushed at Tewkesbury. Edward IV had regained his throne. The prince of the rival house, Edward of Westminster, only son of Henry VI, had died in battle, an heir without a legacy. And now, with Lancaster's military backbone broken and its leadership scattered or dead, only one piece remained on the board: the king himself. Henry VI, once crowned in 2 kingdoms, was now little more than a prisoner in the Tower of London, the same tower where princes vanished and stories blurred. His reign had been marked by fits of piety, passivity, and long stretches of what chroniclers politely called withdrawn mind. He was to some a saintly figure, to others a human vacuum in royal robes. On May 21, 1471, just days after Edward IV's triumphant re-entry into London, Henry died. The official word was quick, simple, and faintly embarrassed. He had died of grief, or sadness, or perhaps natural causes. The reports did not elaborate, and the people did not believe them. The suspicion took root almost immediately, not only among defeated Lancastrians clinging to martyrdom, but also in the wider public. Henry had been alive and stable in confinement for years. Why would he die now, coincidentally, neatly, just after the last of his military allies had been killed and the crown finally secured by his rival? The timing wasn't suspicious. It was theatrical. To this day, the death of Henry VI sits under a cloud of carefully curated ambiguity. The records are vague. The physicians are silent. The chroniclers disagree. And the man who had the most to gain from Henry's death, Edward IV, had at that moment just re-established power and had little incentive to entertain alternate narratives. Let's unpack the possibilities. Theory 1. Henry died of natural causes. It's not implausible. By 1471, Henry was in his late 40s, no small feat in an era of plagues, rebellions, and bad physicians. His health, both physical and mental, had been described as fragile for years. Some chroniclers speak of periods of near catatonia, long silences, and an inability to engage with the world around him. It's possible that the emotional shock of losing his son and the collapse of his political cause pushed him into terminal decline. But that's the kind of explanation history uses when it doesn't want to admit the alternative. Theory 2. Henry was murdered, quietly, efficiently, and on purpose. This is the version that has clung to the edges of the record, whispered by those who felt the official narrative was just a bit too convenient. According to this line of thought, Edward IV, now secure on the throne, saw Henry VI as a liability. The Lancastrian line, though bloodied, wasn't fully broken unless Henry was out of the picture. Even a king in a cell can be dangerous. He is a banner to rally behind, a symbol of continuity, a royal bloodline still pulsing. As long as Henry lived, the war wasn't truly over. The simplest way to close the chapter was to remove the last sentence. Edward's political logic was brutal, but consistent. In a world where battles decided legitimacy and bloodlines served as both crown and weapon, having your rival's figurehead quietly expire in your custody was, tactically, very tidy. Enter the reports from contemporaries. The Croyland Chronicle, written soon after the event, simply notes that Henry died during the night in the Tower. Other sources, like Polydore Virgil, writing later, hint more directly. Henry was put to death. Virgil, writing under Tudor patronage, had his own agenda, but his phrasing suggests that even decades later the matter wasn't closed. Perhaps the most pointed claim comes from Edward Hall, a 16th century historian who wrote that Henry was put to death with a dagger. Hall's work blends fact and dramatic narrative, but his assertion gained traction. By the time of Shakespeare, the idea that Henry had been murdered in the Tower was cultural canon. In Henry VI, Part 3, Shakespeare shows Gloucester, the future Richard III, personally stabbing the helpless king. A theatrical flourish, to be sure, but one that dramatizes a suspicion already centuries old. It's important to note that no one ever stood trial for Henry's death. No inquiry was held. No statement issued. His body was displayed publicly for a brief time, reportedly to show there were no signs of violence. But even that act, meant to quell rumors, raised questions. Why was such a display needed at all, unless the rumors were already loud? His remains were buried at Chertsey Abbey, far from the grandeur of Westminster. It was not the resting place of a king whose legitimacy had ever been recognized by the regime in power. Only later, under the Tudors, would his body be moved to St. George's Chapel at Windsor, his image rehabilitated, and his piety remembered in softer terms. So what keeps this mystery alive? First, the historical context. Henry's death came at the end of a violent chapter, in which legitimacy was contested through war and assassination as much as lineage. The execution of rivals, quiet or public, was not an aberration. It was policy. Second, the silence. No detailed account of his last moments survives. No doctor's notes. No attending testimony. Just a flat statement of death, tucked neatly behind a political triumph. In medieval England, few things are more suspicious than a clean ending. Third, the benefit. Edward IV had everything to gain by ending Henry's life. With Henry and his son gone, the Lancastrian cause lost its royal spine. There were still rebels, yes, but no obvious figurehead. And without a living king to rally behind, rebellion becomes nostalgia. And yet, there remains the possibility that Henry did die naturally, that the stress, the captivity, and the loss of his only son pushed him over the edge, that the tragedy was not murder, but timing, that Edward, for all his political ruthlessness, didn't need to act because history did it for him. But history, when convenient, is very good at protecting its own narrative. We may never know the truth. The documents are too sparse. The sources too contradictory. The truth may lie somewhere in the gap between silence and suggestion. What's certain is that Henry VI's death marked the end of the first phase of the Wars of the Roses, the quiet between dynastic storms. For a brief moment it looked like York had won. And then, out of exile, and out of nowhere, came a boy king's ghost, claiming not only the crown but the right to rewrite the whole story. Or at least, that's what his supporters hoped. Because even when the last king has died, there's always another one waiting in the wings. Or in this case, a deposed monarch whose death was also suspicious, whose disappearance was also convenient, and whose enemies were just as eager to erase him from the record. Or at least, to try. 8. Did Richard II die in captivity or escape? In February of 1400, a short, efficient announcement filtered through the political corridors of England. Richard II, once king, now deposed, had died in Pontefract Castle. The phrasing was vague, the timing was perfect, and the body, when it finally emerged, was too late for questions and too early for certainty. Richard's fall from power had been spectacular in its speed and strangely polite in its tone. After nearly 2 decades on the throne, he was ousted not by an enemy army, but by a cousin, Henry Bolingbroke, who would become Henry IV. The justification was dressed in parliamentary robes. Richard had misruled, overreached, and alienated the nobility. The subtext was simpler. Henry had returned from exile with enough military muscle and baronial backing to claim the crown by might, then retroactively by right. But claiming the throne and holding it were two very different things. As long as Richard lived, he remained a political liability, a symbol, a figurehead for resistance. And England, freshly minted under new management, had no appetite for Civil War version 2.0. So Richard was taken to Pontefract Castle. And a few weeks later, dead. No details, no coroner's report, no immediate explanation, just dead. Contemporary sources give us the standard narrative, trimmed and sterilized. Richard, we're told, died from the consequences of captivity, possibly neglect, possibly illness, possibly self-induced. The language is as non-committal as it is convenient, but almost immediately doubts crept in. There was no public confirmation of the death, no eyewitness account widely shared, and no trial, despite the fact that Richard had been accused, if not officially, then politically, of tyrannical overreach. He had been deposed with unusual ceremony. Wouldn't his death have warranted something more visible? Instead, we are handed a narrative with smooth corners and no fingerprints. The first real confirmation, the public, had came weeks later, when Henry IV displayed a body, allegedly Richard's, in St. Paul's Cathedral, lying in state for public viewing. The purpose was clear: show the people that the king was dead, that the old regime had truly ended, and that the new one had no rivals lurking in the shadows. But even that moment was ambiguous. Descriptions of the body are sparse. Some claimed it looked emaciated, others that it had decayed more than expected. In a time without photography, this meant nothing could be confirmed. Anyone with a similar build and enough misfortune could play the role of a dead king. And as with all mysterious deaths, the rumors began. The most persistent of these was simple. Richard II hadn't died at all. He had escaped. Smuggled out. Hidden away by loyalists. Protected by foreign allies. Survived long enough, in exile or monastic disguise, to become a living rebuke to Henry's new regime. The escape theory is often dismissed as romantic fiction, the sort of hopeful lie that exiled nobles tell themselves to justify one more rebellion. But the evidence, while circumstantial, is strangely durable. In 1402, a rebellion erupted in Wales under Owen Glyndwr, and Richard's name surfaced. Then came the Epiphany Rising, a failed coup by Richard's former allies, launched just after his alleged death. The timing was curious. If Richard was truly gone, what were they rising for? Who were they planning to restore? Some chroniclers report that the conspirators genuinely believed Richard was alive and would return. In Scotland, reports of a man claiming to be the deposed king gained traction. And in France, particularly among the court that had once supported Richard's marriage alliance with Isabella of Valois, the claim that he had survived never quite died. The most dramatic moment came in 1403, when a pretender appeared in Scotland claiming to be Richard II. This man was received by the Duke of Albany, who governed Scotland at the time. He was treated as a legitimate guest, even paraded as a curiosity. Henry IV took the matter seriously enough to demand extradition, unsuccessfully. This figure vanished from the record soon after, but not before causing enough disruption to provoke nervous energy in Westminster. Of course, from the Tudor point of view, writing more than a century later, these rumors were easy to manage. They could be dismissed as invention, distraction, or symbolic opposition. But for Henry IV, in the fragile early years of his reign, they were dangerous. Even if Richard had died, the idea that he might not have was enough to destabilize things. And that's the uncomfortable truth of royal mystery. It's not the body that matters, it's the belief. Belief in Richard's survival gave his supporters a cause, a focus, a name to rally behind, even if the man himself was gone. And Henry IV, for all his careful positioning, knew that as long as the previous king cast a shadow, real or imagined, his own rule would remain provisional. We can speculate endlessly. Maybe Richard did die, quietly and alone in a cold castle after being methodically removed from the world he once ruled. Maybe he was murdered discreetly, a necessary evil framed as natural justice. Or maybe he lived, just long enough to make the new regime sweat, then disappear into legend. What we do know is that Henry IV worked hard to control the narrative. After the public display of the body, he had Richard's remains moved to King's Langley, buried modestly and with little fanfare. Only later, under Henry V, when the political climate was safer, were his bones reinterred in Westminster Abbey beside his first wife, Anne of Bohemia. That reburial, often framed as an act of piety or reconciliation, was also a gesture of finality, a state-sponsored ending to a story that had refused to end cleanly. The deeper question isn't what happened to Richard, but what his disappearance tells us about monarchy. Royal power in medieval England was a performance as much as a policy. A king wasn't just a man in a chair. He was an image, a presence, a claim. And once deposed, that claim didn't vanish. It just became dangerous. Richard's story lingers precisely because it's unfinished. His reign began with hope, an intelligent, cultured king who wrote poetry and dreamed of peace. It ended with silence. A vanishing act, followed by a burial with more questions than witnesses. And just as the dust seemed to settle, another mystery rose. Not from the ruins of deposition, but from the battlefield of Hastings, where another fallen king's body became the subject of centuries-long dispute. A king struck down in the most famous invasion in English history, whose burial place may never be known for sure. 9. The burial of Harold II. Waltham Abbey or Bosham. For most English monarchs, history offers at least the courtesy of a definite location. A place to mark the end. A tomb, a slab, a carved effigy beneath a vaulted ceiling, where names and dates are chiseled into stone as though that alone could settle the matter. But Harold II, the last crowned Anglo-Saxon king of England, did not receive such a courtesy. On October 14, 1066, Harold fell at the Battle of Hastings, a defeat so total it broke not only a dynasty, but a cultural world. What followed was not merely a change of ruler, but a systemic overwrite, a Norman conquest that buried Saxon England beneath stone keeps, French law, and a new aristocracy of strangers. What it didn't do, curiously, was bury the king. Or at least, not in a way anyone can agree on. Ask where Harold's body lies, and you'll get two main answers, both delivered with equal confidence and equally lacking in conclusive proof. Waltham Abbey or Bosham or church. The first is grand, royal, symbolic. The second, modest, coastal, and just as plausible. Neither is definitive. Both are incomplete, and both are part of a mystery that has outlived the man himself by nearly 1,000 years. The traditional story goes like this. After the battle, William the Conqueror allowed Harold's mother, Geitha, to retrieve her son's body from the battlefield. Accounts differ wildly on what condition the body was in, how it was identified, and what permission was granted. Some claim William refused the request. Others say he agreed, on the condition it be buried in secret. A few even suggest that the body was too damaged to be sure it was Harold at all. This uncertainty didn't stop the legend from forming. Waltham Abbey, Harold's own foundation in Essex, completed just a few years before the Norman invasion, quickly became the favored answer. According to Waltham Chronicle, a 12th century text with monastic pride to protect, Harold's body was brought there under cover of night. The monks buried him in secret, out of respect, out of loyalty, or simply out of fear. For centuries, this remained the official story. Pilgrims came. Locals told tales. A stone slab in the abbey ruins even bears the inscription, Harold, King of England, obit 1066, buried on this hill. It feels final. Except, it probably isn't. No physical evidence has ever been found beneath the site. Multiple excavations, most recently in the 20th century, have turned up nothing conclusive. No bones, no coffin, just an enduring idea. Which brings us to Bosham, a quiet village on the Sussex coast with a church that predates the conquest. Inside it, under the floor of the chancel, lies a stone tomb. Local tradition claims it holds the remains of King Harold, not because it was recorded in chronicles, but because of the bones found there. In the 1950s, archaeologists opened the tomb and found a man's skeleton, missing the head. That detail alone sent shivers through the historical community. After all, several early accounts of the Battle of Hastings claimed that Harold's body had been mutilated or beheaded in the aftermath. The problem? Carbon dating. The bones predated 1066 by a wide margin, possibly even going back to the 11th century's early decades. So not entirely ruled out, but not comfortably matched either. Still, the idea stuck. Bosham had a legitimate connection to Harold's family. His father, Godwin, Earl of Wessex, held lands there. Some believe Harold himself was born nearby. The church would have been familiar, perhaps even meaningful. And so we are left with a story split between two graves, neither confirmed, both contested. One wrapped in royal ritual, the other in local tradition. One associated with the final chapter of Anglo-Saxon kingship, the other with a quieter, more personal memory. There is, of course, a third theory, that Harold wasn't buried in either place. Some medieval sources, Scandinavian, mostly, suggest that Harold survived Hastings, that he was grievously wounded, perhaps captured, and that he fled or was smuggled away, that he lived out his days as a hermit or in exile, far from the halls of power. These are outlier tales, often regarded more as folklore than history, but their persistence speaks to something deeper, a refusal, perhaps, to let the last English king vanish into a Norman footnote. Because in many ways, Harold's story is not just about his death, it's about what came after. His reign was brief, just 9 months, but its symbolic weight is enormous. He was the final link in a native dynasty that had ruled since Alfred the Great. His defeat marked the end of Anglo-Saxon England and the beginning of a centuries-long reconfiguration of language, law, and identity. His death should have been commemorated. His burial should have been monumental. Instead, he was overwritten. And that, perhaps, is the most unsettling part of the mystery. The Normans wrote their own history. William of Poitiers, Orderic Vitalis, and the Anglo-Norman chroniclers emphasized divine favor and legal right. In that narrative, Harold had broken an oath and was punished. He was an obstacle, not a martyr. His body, like his reign, was better forgotten. Even the Bayeux Tapestry, that great embroidered screenplay of the conquest, offers only a hint. In the final scene, a fallen warrior is labeled, "Harold is killed." But which of the tangled bodies is him? There is no clarity, just thread, suggestion, and interpretation. Centuries later, kings with far more dubious claims to fame lie beneath monuments and cathedral vaults. Harold, by contrast, lies somewhere or nowhere. Which is why the question of his burial still haunts scholars. Because it's not just about a location. It's about legitimacy, closure, memory. To find Harold's grave would be to reclaim part of a lost history. Not just a body, but a moment. A turning point when one world ended and another began. Anglo-Saxon England didn't fade quietly. It ended with fire, iron, and silence. And Harold, its final symbol, was swallowed by that silence. Modern technology could help, in theory. Ground-penetrating radar, forensic testing, DNA comparison. But without clear leads, the search remains speculative. And institutions, both religious and governmental, have been reluctant to disturb centuries-old burial sites on the basis of historical hunches. So we wait. With two possible graves, a scattering of chronicles, and a narrative that ends not with a crown passed, but a body misplaced. It is possible that the answer will never come. That Harold's bones lie in neither Waltham nor Bosham. That they were left on the battlefield, burned, scattered, lost to time. But the mystery remains compelling because of what it represents. The disappearance of a king at the precise moment when England itself disappeared in one form and emerged in another. Harold's unknown resting place is more than a historical oddity. It is the blank space at the end of a national story, the spot where the Anglo-Saxon script was torn off mid-sentence and rewritten in another hand. And just as we try to imagine the last moments of the last English king, another figure steps onto the stage. A young boy king, betrayed not on a battlefield, but at a dinner table. Poisoned? Plotted against? Or simply another casualty of a throne too heavy for any child to carry alone? 10. The murder of Edward the Martyr. Who benefited? In the year 978, a boy rode toward a royal residence in Dorset, likely weary from travel, unaware that the welcome awaiting him would be anything but warm. His name was Edward, and though his reign as King of England had lasted just over 3 years, it had been anything but secure. He was barely a teenager, sitting precariously on a throne that too many powerful men considered more of a question mark than a fact. When the day ended, Edward was dead. There was no battlefield, no siege, no rebellion. Just a swift act near the gates of Corfe, the kind of act that changes dynasties but leaves historians in the dark. His body, unceremoniously handled, was hidden at first. Later, it was reburied, twice, with increasing reverence and a new title, the Martyr. Which tells us something important. No one ever believed his death was simply unfortunate. From the beginning, it was treated as suspicious, even sacred, a moment of wrongdoing, large enough to demand spiritual framing. So what exactly happened to Edward? Let's start with the knowns, which are few. Edward was the son of Edgar the Peaceful, a rare king in Anglo-Saxon England whose epithet wasn't ironic. His rule had been one of relative calm, a breathing space between the Viking storm and the coming Norman hurricane. When Edgar died in 975, succession became a contest not of warfare, but of bloodlines, loyalties, and ecclesiastical backing. Edward was the elder son, but his position wasn't secure. His mother, Ethelfled Aneda, had died years earlier. His half-brother Ethelred, later to be known as the Unready, which meant poorly advised, not unprepared, was younger, but had a living mother with ambition and connections, Queen Elfthryth. So the court divided. On one side were Edward's backers, reform-minded clergy, especially Archbishop Dunstan, and some members of the old guard who respected his father's wishes. On the other side, Queen Elfthryth and her faction, many of whom viewed Edward as a barrier to their own influence. Ethelred, though younger, was a cleaner political slate, a child whose reign could be shaped by the right hands. Edward's supporters got there first. He was crowned king in 975, but his authority never truly settled. Sources from the period, especially monastic chroniclers, portray him as pious, devout, and committed to religious reform. In other words, the kind of king those chroniclers liked to write about. But behind the scenes, his reign was contested. England in the late 10th century was politically fragmented, and though Edward sat on the throne, much of the power lay in the hands of competing noble factions. All of which sets the stage for his death. In 978, Edward traveled to Corfe, where Queen Elfthryth and young Ethelred were staying. He arrived alone or with a small entourage, sources differ. He was offered hospitality, dismounted, and then, according to the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, was suddenly attacked and killed. The method is debated. Some sources say he was struck down as he drank. Others suggest a more chaotic scuffle. All agree, however, that it happened swiftly and that it was not a death befitting a king. The body was hastily buried, hidden really, before being moved and reburied with greater ceremony months later, then again at Shaftesbury Abbey, where it became a site of pilgrimage. The narrative quickly shifted. Edward had been wronged, martyred not for his faith per se, but for the moral disorder of his enemies. And yet, for all the religious framing, the political question remained. Who benefited? The immediate answer is obvious. Ethelred. At just 10 years old, he became king following his half-brother's death. His reign would be long and turbulent, marked by invasions, indecision, and political chaos. But that was all in the future. In 978, he was a boy king whose sudden promotion cleared the board for those around him. But did he or his camp orchestrate the killing? It's unlikely that Ethelred himself was involved. He was too young to plot. But his mother, Elfthryth, was another matter. Medieval chroniclers, always eager to moralize, cast her in an ominous light. Later sources describe her as cunning, power-hungry, even treacherous. She is painted as a Lady Macbeth figure avant la lettre, manipulative, shadowy, ambitious. It's tempting to believe this narrative, but it's also suspiciously convenient. Women who wielded political influence in the early Middle Ages were often accused of poisoning, seduction, and covert violence, especially when no male scapegoat was handy. Still, Elfthryth's proximity to the event cannot be ignored. Edward died at her residence. Her son became king. No formal investigation was ever launched. The entire affair was wrapped in piety and guilt before anyone asked too many legal questions. Other possible culprits include nobles disgruntled by Edward's favoring of monastic reforms, particularly those who had lost land or influence under the church-backed administration. Edward had aligned himself with Dunstan and the monastic movement, which pushed for stricter religious observance and a redistribution of certain lands back to the church. That made him enemies. But this explanation, while plausible, is less satisfying. The assassination was too convenient, too targeted, and it didn't just remove a king, it elevated a new one. Ethelred's coronation occurred within weeks of Edward's death. There was no interregnum, no alternative candidate. The political machinery turned smoothly, suspiciously smoothly, And yet, despite all of this, no one was punished. No culprit was named. No trial was held. The silence following Edward's death wasn't just deafening, it was strategic. Instead of blame, there was sanctification. Edward was declared a martyr by the church within a few years of his death. Miracles were reported at his tomb. Pilgrims arrived in droves. His story was wrapped in divine language, and the earthly questions, motive, method, responsibility, were left to rot in the corners of history. The effect was powerful. The murder was transformed from a political crime into a spiritual cautionary tale. The injustice wasn't to a dynasty, but to the moral order of the world, and that shift allowed those in power to avoid scrutiny. But the mystery remains unresolved. If Elfthryth orchestrated Edward's murder, it was a calculated and brutally effective power move. If others acted in her name, it was a coup hidden under the veil of succession. If it was the result of spontaneous factional violence, it was nonetheless perfectly timed to achieve a political transition. None of the possibilities offer certainty, but they all reflect the instability of royal rule in pre-conquest England. Kingship was fragile, succession was rarely clean, and power often required more than inheritance. It demanded removal. Edward the Martyr's death reminds us that in early medieval England, the throne was rarely passed. It was taken, often in silence, often in shadow. His story, like so many royal mysteries, is less about a single moment and more about what that moment allowed. And just as the church was elevating Edward to sainthood, another royal figure was quietly crossing back into England. A prince born in exile returning home, not to rule, but to die before he could. Or perhaps, if one follows the more curious accounts, to vanish into history before he ever had the chance. 11. The lost years of Edward the Exile and the succession that might have been. In the long shadow of King Edward the Confessor's reign, as the English crown trembled on the edge of catastrophe, an unexpected figure stepped ashore, one the court had all but forgotten, or perhaps hoped would stay forgotten. His name was Edward the Exile, son of Edmund Ironside, grandson of Ethelred the Unready, and by blood, a direct descendant of Alfred the Great. He had returned home after a lifetime abroad, a ghost from a different royal line, arriving not with fanfare, but with confusion. And then, within months, he was dead. No throne, no coronation, no second act, just disappearance again. Only this time, into the archives. The mystery of Edward the Exile isn't wrapped in assassins or court conspiracies in the traditional sense. His death wasn't explosive. It was quiet, poorly recorded, and remained suspicious precisely because it seemed to resolve too many problems at once, problems that had plagued English succession for decades. To understand how strange this story is, you have to rewind to 1016, when the English crown passed, violently, from Edmund Ironside to Canute the Great, a Danish invader who managed to make himself look like a restorer of order rather than a foreign conqueror. After a brief co-rule between Edmund and Canute, Edmund conveniently died, and Canute took full control. Edmund's sons, Edward and Edmund, were quickly deemed a threat and sent abroad. Not executed, but exiled, shuffled off the board and out of the realm. It was a diplomatic solution with plausible deniability. No blood on the throne, but no heirs nearby either. For decades, no one in England really heard from Edward the Exile. He vanished into the vast landscape of continental politics. Some sources suggest he lived in Hungary, possibly under the protection of King Stephen I, and married into the local nobility. A strange life for the son of an English king, alien in language, custom, and power. Meanwhile, back in England, the ruling House of Wessex was thinning. By the time Edward the Confessor assumed the throne in 1042, the royal bloodline was running low. He had no children, his siblings had all died, his extended relatives were few. The aging king had no direct heir, and in a monarchy where legitimacy was everything, that was a problem with a ticking clock. It was in this context, in 1056 or 1057, that Edward the Exile was invited back to England. After 4 decades abroad, a prince no one had seen since infancy was now being summoned home. The idea, presumably, was to name him heir, something to stabilize the succession after the confessor's eventual death. This was more than symbolic. Edward the Exile had the right bloodline. He was the only surviving male of his generation with a direct claim to the royal house. His return would give the confessor a successor who wasn't a foreigner, a child, or a noble pretending to be royal. He was, by dynastic standards, the perfect answer. Except, of course, that he died almost immediately after arriving. Within days or months, sources aren't quite sure, Edward the Exile was dead. No clear cause, no dramatic illness, no official investigation. Just dead, with a wife and children left behind in a kingdom he barely remembered. This is the moment where the question sharpens. Why did Edward the Exile die so quickly? Was it natural? Coincidental? Or was there more at play? No chronicler of the time directly accuses anyone. But that's not particularly comforting. Anglo-Saxon historians were rarely in the habit of openly accusing powerful figures of foul play. Instead, they leave silences. And silence, in this case, stretches louder than anything they wrote. It is possible that Edward died of stress, disease, or simple bad luck. Travel in the 11th century was punishing. Even royal journeys lacked the modern comforts of hygiene or safety. A lifetime abroad could have left him vulnerable to foreign pathogens or courtly missteps. But the timing is clean, too clean. Edward the Confessor was known for his reluctance to share power. His court was tightly controlled by the Godwin family, especially Harold Godwinson, who had ambitions of his own. Harold had no royal blood, but he had influence. If Edward the Exile were to become heir, Harold's path to power would narrow considerably. So imagine for a moment the political math. Edward the Exile returns. He is declared heir. He brings with him a wife and 3 children, among them a boy named Edgar, later called Edgar the Etheling. Suddenly, the succession is no longer up for grabs. That would have been a problem for anyone eyeing the throne. The confessor's death in 1066, just 9 years later, triggered the most infamous succession crisis in English history. Harold Godwinson seized the throne. William of Normandy invaded to claim it. Harald Hardrada of Norway threw his helmet into the ring, and Edgar Etheling, son of Edward the Exile, was technically the legitimate heir, but too young and too unsupported to press his claim. If Edward the Exile had lived, the situation might have unfolded very differently. No ambiguity, no usurpation, no excuse for invasion. A crowned Anglo-Saxon king might have stood between England and the Norman conquest. But he didn't. Instead, his sudden death cleared the board, leaving his son too young, his wife too foreign, and his claim too fragile. And history, opportunist that it is, moved on without him. What's most unsettling is not the lack of proof for foul play, but the number of people who stood to benefit from his removal. The Godwins, with their hunger for power. William of Normandy, who needed a succession crisis to justify his invasion. Even Edward the Confessor himself, if he feared a challenge to his authority during his lifetime. No one wrote it down. No one confessed. But sometimes a death speaks volumes by how quiet it is. Edward, the exile's brief return stands as one of those strange pivot points in history where a single life might have changed everything. Instead, it ended too soon, too cleanly, and left behind a succession so muddled it invited war. And just when England thought it had buried that chapter, another royal body fell, this time in the middle of a civil war, after a royal treasury vanished and rumors began to swirl of something more deliberate than disease. 12. King John's death. Disease, poison, or political myth-making? By the autumn of 1216, King John of England was not merely losing a war, he was losing his kingdom, his health, and his patience, often all at once. The French had invaded, the barons had rebelled, the Magna Carta had been issued, revoked, and weaponized, and the king himself was increasingly described in terms that were, at best, unflattering and at worst, catastrophic. Then, just as everything reached a boiling point, the king died. Like so many moments in English royal history, the death of King John came at precisely the moment it was most useful to someone else, and was followed by a narrative just ambiguous enough to remain suspicious for centuries. Let's set the scene. It's October 1216. John is in the midst of a military retreat. The French army, led by Prince Louis, later Louis VIII of France, has landed on English soil, joined by rebellious barons who've had enough of John's chaotic rule. The Plantagenet crown, for all intents and purposes, is hanging by a thread. During this chaotic campaign, John travels westward through the fens of East Anglia, a treacherous region known more for its boggy terrain than for military strategy. In a moment of poor judgment or urgent necessity, possibly both, John decides to cross the Wash, a wide estuary prone to sudden flooding and shifting sands. Disaster follows. According to several accounts, John's baggage train is swallowed by the tides. Wagons, horses, provisions, and most damning of all, the royal treasure, sink into the marshes. Chests of gold, jewels, crown insignia, and government records vanish beneath the mud. The incident isn't just a logistical nightmare, it's an omen. It looks, to his contemporaries, like divine judgment. Shortly after this debacle, while at a monastery in Newark, John falls ill. Within a few days, he is dead. That's the official sequence. Bad luck, bad terrain, sudden illness, royal death. End scene. But the details are slippery. Contemporary chroniclers offer several causes for the king's decline. Roger of Wendover, one of the most cited sources, claims that John succumbed to dysentery, a common enough illness in medieval campaigns. Others cite fever, stress, or even overindulgence, pointing to a lavish meal of peaches, beer, and seafood consumed shortly before his symptoms worsened. Still others, writing a bit later and with sharper quills, whisper something darker: poison. It's this possibility that has kept John's death open-ended for historians and amateur sleuths alike. Was the king merely another casualty of medieval hygiene, or was he removed, quietly, efficiently, by someone who saw his exit as the key to stabilizing a realm on the edge? To answer that, we need to remember what John represented at the time of his death. He was not merely unpopular, he was reviled. Even by medieval standards, where kings could be tyrants, warmongers, and absentee landlords. John had managed to burn nearly every bridge. He fought with the Pope, alienated the barons, lost Normandy, bankrupted the royal coffers, and levied taxes with such persistence that the economy buckled. He had failed in diplomacy, law, and war. In fact, John's reign had become so destabilizing that many English nobles preferred a French prince to their own king. That's not hyperbole. That's treason as policy. So when the king suddenly died, there was little mourning, only rapid reorganization. His 9-year-old son, Henry, was crowned almost immediately. The barons, now free of the man they despised, rallied behind the child. Prince Louis's support evaporated. Within months, the French invasion collapsed. The Magna Carta was reissued in a revised form. Order, or something like it, was restored. And so the question arises, was John's death convenient? Poison was a familiar rumor in royal circles. When powerful people died suddenly, especially at moments of political crisis, poison was the go-to explanation. It implied agency. It turned death from accident into strategy. But there is no forensic proof, no autopsy, no eyewitness testimony that could confirm such a method. All we have are ambiguous phrases, timing, and the ever-reliable presence of motive. There were many who stood to gain from John's removal. The English barons, desperate for a less volatile monarch. The church, still healing from John's earlier excommunication. even members of his own court who had suffered under his erratic decision-making. But would any of them risk an assassination when the king was already unraveling under the weight of his own failures? Some argue they didn't need to. John's health had been poor for years. His behavior in his final months, paranoid, panicked, erratic, suggests a man already in physical and psychological decline. The loss of the royal treasure was not just humiliating, it was shattering. It broke something in him. After the disaster in the wash, he reportedly never recovered emotionally. And yet, the mystery remains. Why did the chroniclers take such care to hint at poison? Why did the narrative drift so quickly into myth? Perhaps the answer lies not in what happened, but in what needed to happen. England in 1216 was collapsing. It needed a reset, and John, flawed, combative, exhausting, had become the obstacle. His death solved more problems than it created. Whether by bacteria or betrayal, it ended a chapter that few wanted to continue reading. In later centuries, the rumors hardened into legend. John the Tyrant, John the Poisoned, John the king who lost everything, including his life, in a country that sighed with relief when he passed. Modern historians lean toward dysentery or infection. The conditions were right, the symptoms plausible. But they also admit that the sources are colored by propaganda, bias, and a desire to make John's death mean something larger than digestive failure, because that's what royal deaths do in history. They become mirrors. We project onto them our fears, our politics, our need for narrative. And John, ever the villain in English folklore, became one of the few monarchs whose passing felt like a solution. That alone makes the circumstances feel curated. So was it poison? Maybe. Was it disease? Probably. Was it convenient? Undeniably. And just as England turned the page with a child king and a revised charter, another child was about to leave the stage, young, bright, and suddenly gone. A boy whose death would spark its own rumors. A prince beloved by the people, mourned by the court, and, perhaps, victim to forces far more political than anyone was willing to admit. 13. Henry, Prince of Wales, 1612. Typhoid fever, or a poison panic. In November 1612, England found itself preparing for a coronation that would never come. Henry Frederick, Prince of Wales, heir to the Stuart throne and son of James I, had been the embodiment of national hope. Handsome, athletic, intellectual, and fiercely Protestant, Henry was seen not only as the future king, but as the antidote to the uneasy reign of his father, a monarch often regarded as too Scottish, too bookish, too conciliatory toward Catholic powers. Henry, in contrast, was everything England told itself it wanted: virile, charismatic, reform-minded, and defiantly anti-Spanish. He was a walking future. Until suddenly, he wasn't. At just 18 years old, Henry fell ill. Within days, he was dead. The country was stunned. The court was thrown into mourning. His family, devastated. But almost as quickly as the tears flowed, the suspicions began. Because it wasn't just a death, it was a disappearance of promise, the sort that rarely escapes conspiracy. What did kill Prince Henry? Was it illness, mismanagement, or something more sinister? Let's begin with the official story. The symptoms began in late October. Henry complained of fatigue, fever, and pain in his side. Physicians were summoned. Diagnoses were offered, none consistent. Treatments ranged from mild to medieval. The consensus, then and now, points toward typhoid fever, a waterborne bacterial infection that killed with ruthless efficiency in the pre-modern world. By early November, Henry was confined to bed. On the 6th, his condition worsened dramatically. On the 7th, he drifted in and out of consciousness. On the 9th, just before midnight, he died. His body was embalmed and laid in state at St. James's Palace, then buried in Westminster Abbey, where a tomb still marks the resting place of the prince who never became king. But within hours of his death, the murmur of poison began to spread. Why? Partly because of timing, partly because of politics, and mostly because people needed an explanation more satisfying than infection. Henry's death came at a moment of intense religious and diplomatic tension. His father, James I, was pursuing a delicate and controversial foreign policy, most notably an effort to arrange a marriage between Henry's younger brother Charles and a Spanish princess. This was seen by many as a betrayal of England's Protestant identity. Spain, after all, was the symbol of Catholic aggression. The gunpowder plot was only 7 years in the past. Anti-Catholic paranoia was at its peak. Henry was openly hostile to Spain and had no intention of marrying into its royal house. He had surrounded himself with Protestant reformers and military thinkers. He admired Henry IV of France, had dreams of crusading in Europe, and had made it clear he would take a more hardline stance against Catholic powers once crowned. To those watching closely, Henry's death did not look like a tragedy. It looked like a political convenience, one less obstacle to rapprochement with Spain, one less Protestant firebrand, one less unpredictable variable. And then came the gossip. Some whispered that his stepmother, Anne of Denmark, disliked him, though there's little evidence of open hostility. Others pointed fingers at the Duke of Lennox, a close confidant of James I, or at unnamed Catholic agents operating in the shadows. One theory even suggested that Henry had been eliminated to make way for Charles, his younger brother, shy, awkward, and far more compliant, who would later become Charles I and eventually lose his head in a civil war that Henry may have avoided entirely. The poison theory gained traction partly because it was never definitively disproven. In the 17th century, medical science lacked the precision to rule out foul play with any certainty. The prince's symptoms, fever, weakness, mental confusion, could describe half a dozen possible causes. Even the autopsy, such as it was, couldn't settle the matter. But it wasn't just the unknowns that fueled suspicion. It was the sheer emotional investment people had made in Henry. Here was a prince raised from birth to be a symbol of the nation. Educated at Magdalen College, Oxford, schooled in statecraft and war. He had his own household by the age of 16 and was already holding court with military leaders and architects. His plans for naval expansion were ambitious. His support for the arts, architecture, and exploration suggested a Renaissance monarch in waiting. He was already commissioning warships, already writing on matters of governance, already establishing himself as a king in all but name. So when he died, abruptly, and at the start of what should have been his reign, the sense of loss was more than familial or political. It was generational. It was mythic. Writers and poets reacted with a kind of literary panic. John Donne, George Herbert, and others mourned him in verse. Ben Jonson wrote bitterly of promise wasted. John Milton, still a child, would later echo Henry's loss in his reflections on England's lost potential. Even foreign courts expressed shock. In France, where Henry was admired, condolences were sent with a mixture of grief and disbelief. In the Low Countries, Protestant leaders spoke of divine judgment. In Spain, reactions were quiet, but not uninterested. The idea of Henry as a murdered prince fit neatly into a growing European narrative. That religious politics, not just war and theology, now decided who lived and who died in royal circles. And yet, centuries later, no hard evidence has surfaced to confirm any plot. No poison was recorded, no confessions made, no smoking goblet found. Modern historians lean toward typhoid as the most likely culprit. The water supply around Richmond Palace, where Henry often stayed, was known to be unsafe. Sanitation was non-existent, and sudden lethal infections were part of everyday life, even for princes. But like so many royal deaths, Henry's is less interesting for how he died than for what his death allowed. Without Henry, James I's diplomatic strategy faced fewer internal challenges. The Spanish match negotiations continued, and eventually collapsed, but not before changing the course of court politics. Charles, quiet and easily molded, stepped into the role of heir, ushering in a future no one had quite planned for. And most of all, Henry became an icon. He was frozen in time as the perfect king who never was. Uncorrupted by rule, untarnished by scandal. England's young lion, dead before his roar. His death became a hinge, between two visions of monarchy, between hope and disillusionment, between Protestant certainty and dynastic compromise. And as England mourned the heir it thought it had, the seeds were already being sown for the questions that would haunt the next generation: legitimacy, succession, and what it really meant to be a true-born prince. A question that, decades earlier, had already shaken the monarchy to its core, when another royal birth was challenged not by illness but by suspicion. A child born in a palace, announced as a future king, and almost instantly accused of being a fraud, smuggled into a royal bed in the dead of night. 14. The warming pan baby. Was James Francis Edward Stuart an impostor? On the morning of June 10, 1688, Queen Mary of Modena, wife of King James II of England, gave birth at St. James's Palace to a healthy baby boy, James Francis Edward Stuart. He was, officially, the long-awaited male heir to the Catholic king, a dynastic triumph that should have secured the Stuart line for another generation. But the reaction was not joy. It was suspicion. By nightfall, whispers were spreading through drawing rooms, taverns, and political salons. The child, it was said, was not the Queen's. He had not been born in the royal bed. He had been smuggled into the room in a warming pan, a metal container used to warm bed sheets, by Catholic conspirators in a plot to place a counterfeit heir on the throne. It was a story so outrageous, so transparent in its absurdity, that it should have collapsed under the weight of its own implausibility. Instead, it set fire to the foundations of the monarchy. What followed was not merely a court scandal, but the glorious revolution, a bloodless coup, at least in England, that would replace James II with his Protestant daughter Mary and her Dutch husband William of Orange. At the heart of it all, a silver warming pan, a missing moment, and a baby whose legitimacy became one of the most consequential questions in English royal history. Let's be clear. There is no serious modern historian who believes the warming pan story to be true. The Queen's labor had been long and difficult. More than 50 witnesses, including prominent Protestant courtiers and physicians, were present at or near the birth. The event had been so politically sensitive that officials made sure the process was observed, specifically to avoid claims of deception. And yet, the rumor didn't die. It multiplied. Why? Because people wanted it to be true, and more importantly, because it served the needs of those who needed James II gone. To understand the full force of the warming pan conspiracy, you have to understand the political context of 1688. James II, a Catholic monarch in a fiercely Protestant country, had already alienated much of the English political establishment. He had suspended laws, packed government offices with Catholic allies, and clashed repeatedly with the Church of England. His previous two wives had only produced daughters, one of whom, Mary, had married the solidly Protestant William of Orange, then serving as a kind of ideological insurance policy for the Anglican elite. As long as James had no male heir, the Protestant establishment could tolerate his reign, just barely. They assumed the crisis would end naturally with his death and Mary's succession. But the birth of a Catholic son changed everything. Now there was a direct Catholic line of succession, the nightmare scenario. And so the warming pan story emerged, not because it was convincing, but because it was useful. Within days, pamphlets circulated anonymously throughout London. Satirical ballads and caricatures mocked the birth. Eyewitnesses were denounced. Questions were asked. Why had the Queen's bed been curtained? Why had the child not cried immediately? Who had seen the baby first? Why had a warming pan been carried into the room earlier in the evening? These were questions not designed to be answered, but to be repeated. They were rhetorical weapons, shaped less to persuade than to provoke, and they worked. Even high-ranking officials at court, many of them Anglican, began to echo doubts about the birth. When 7 English nobles secretly wrote to William of Orange, inviting him to invade, one of their central justifications was the dubious nature of the prince's birth. The warming pan baby was not just a story, it was a pretext. When William landed in England in November 1688, he brought with him not only soldiers but a narrative. He wasn't invading, he claimed. He was rescuing England from a Catholic takeover, engineered by deception. James II fled without battle. Parliament declared the throne vacant, and Mary and William were crowned joint monarchs. In the aftermath, Parliament tried to investigate the circumstances of James Francis Edward's birth. Unsurprisingly, the results were inconclusive. Witnesses contradicted each other. Testimony was politicized. The royal family had fled. The revolution had already happened. No one was interested in forensic truth. The myth had already done its job. The warming pan legend outlived the moment. For Jacobites, the supporters of James II and his descendants, the prince was the legitimate king, James III. For the new regime, he was a footnote of fraud, a Catholic pretender. His life would be spent in exile, referred to variously as the Old Pretender and the Warming Pan Baby, depending on whether the speaker favored bloodline or religion. He attempted to reclaim the throne in 1715 in the ill-fated Jacobite Rising, but the rebellion collapsed. His son, Charles Edward Stuart, Bonnie Prince Charlie, would try again in 1745 with similar failure. But through it all, the warming pan rumor remained. It was recited as fact in English schoolbooks well into the 19th century. It was repeated in sermons, stage plays, and polite dinner conversations. It became a shorthand for political fraud, the baby who arrived with no proof and too much timing. What's remarkable is how institutionalized the rumor became. It was, in effect, state propaganda, informal, decentralized, but widely adopted. It turned a living boy into a symbol of deception. It erased his claim not through legal refutation, but through ridicule. And this is perhaps the most disturbing power of conspiracy in royal history. Once planted, even the most ridiculous story can grow roots if it serves enough agendas. The warming pan baby didn't need to be real. He just needed to be believable enough to justify action. In that way, the story becomes more than a historical curiosity. It is a case study in how succession can be manipulated, not just by armies or legislation, but by narrative warfare, a kind of soft coup fought with gossip and paper and careful silence. And just as James Francis Edward Stuart was being recast as a fraud in public memory, another royal woman found herself the subject of a quieter, more personal mystery. Lady Catherine Grey, whose love story may have rewritten the line of succession, had anyone been willing to admit it ever really happened. 15. Did Lady Catherine Grey secretly marry, and were her sons legitimate heirs? She was born with a crown-shaped shadow over her life. Lady Catherine Grey, younger sister to the ill-fated Lady Jane Grey, was not a queen. She never sat on a throne. She never led an army or signed an act of parliament. But for a fleeting, precarious moment in the middle of the 16th century, she may have been the most dangerous woman in England, and the most quietly erased. Her name doesn't echo through Tudor history like Elizabeth's or Mary's or Anne Boleyn's. But behind the velvet curtains of succession politics, Catherine's story posed a greater threat to Elizabeth I's throne than most realized. Not because of what she did, but because of what she might have done. She may have secretly married and borne 2 sons, children who, if legitimate, carried a stronger legal claim to the English crown than the Queen herself. And the crown, as always, had a way of making inconvenient love stories disappear. The roots of this mystery begin with the tangled aftermath of Henry VIII's will, a document that laid out a complex and fragile line of succession. After Edward VI, then Mary, then Elizabeth, the next heirs were to come from the Suffolk line, descendants of Henry's younger sister, Mary Tudor. That meant the Greys. Lady Jane Grey's 9-day reign in 1553 was a violent hiccup in this dynastic plan. After her execution, her sister Catherine inherited the dubious distinction of being a legitimate Protestant heir with just enough royal blood to be dangerous, and just enough of a reputation to keep people whispering. Enter Edward Seymour, Earl of Hertford, the eldest son of the Duke of Somerset and nephew of Jane Seymour, third wife of Henry VIII. He was well-born, well-connected, and, crucially, Protestant. Catherine and Edward moved in the same elite circles. They had similar political sympathies. And according to both contemporary rumor and later court testimony, they fell in love, which is, in Tudor England, a near-capital offense if you happen to be a royal heir. Sometime around 1560, when Elizabeth was still early in her reign and unmarried, Catherine and Edward may have secretly wed, without royal permission, which was required by law for any potential successor to marry. Why keep it secret? Because had the marriage been known, it would have provoked immediate consequences. Elizabeth, fiercely protective of her own claim and status, had no desire to see a younger, fertile cousin produce heirs who might outshine her in legitimacy. Yet if the marriage was real, and the evidence suggests it may have been, it happened nonetheless. Catherine soon became pregnant. The alarm that swept through the Tudor court at the news was not merely about the breach of protocol. It was about the child's potential to become king. Elizabeth responded in the way that Tudor monarchs often did, with a mixture of personal fury and strategic containment. Catherine was imprisoned in the Tower of London, separated from Edward, who was also locked away. In 1561, she gave birth to a son, Edward Seymour, Viscount Beauchamp, within the Tower's stone walls. The baby survived. A second son, Thomas, would be born later, likely conceived during a clandestine reunion between the imprisoned couple. And here's where the mystery tightens its grip. Was the marriage valid? Were the children legitimate? Because if they were, Catherine's eldest son had a claim to the throne stronger than Elizabeth's, based on both Henry VIII's will and the laws of primogeniture. He was a male heir, Protestant, born of a union between two royally connected figures, but proving the marriage turned out to be nearly impossible. The couple had no marriage certificate. The priest who allegedly performed the ceremony either vanished or refused to testify. The witnesses were few, and those that existed were under pressure. The law demanded documentation, but the union had been deliberately hidden. Love had made it secret. Politics made it unprovable. Under interrogation, Catherine maintained that she and Edward were married. Her supporters tried to produce evidence, but Elizabeth's government saw no incentive to validate the claim. A formal declaration of legitimacy would not only threaten the Queen's rule, it might rally discontented Protestants around an alternative succession. So the official verdict was ambiguity. No proof. Which, in Tudor politics, was the safest answer when the truth was too dangerous to name. Catherine remained confined. Her health deteriorated. She died in 1568, just 27 years old, her fate echoing her sister Jane's, though not by sword, but by suffocation of circumstance. Her children were not executed, nor formally disinherited, but they were quietly excluded from power, their claims allowed to exist in shadow, but never daylight. And yet, the idea of Catherine's hidden dynasty never fully died. In the decades after her death, especially during the later succession crises of Elizabeth's childless reign, whispers about the Grey-Seymour line resurfaced. Some courtiers kept careful track of Catherine's sons, noting their movements, their marriages, their children. There was always the faint possibility that should Elizabeth die without a clear heir, these forgotten princes might be dusted off and offered to the throne. They never were. After Elizabeth's death in 1603, the crown passed to James VI of Scotland, uniting the English and Scottish crowns under the Stuart line. James's claim came through Margaret Tudor, Henry VIII's older sister, rather than Mary Tudor, from whom the Greys descended. Ironically, had Henry VIII's will been followed to the letter, Catherine Grey's son Edward Seymour may have been the rightful heir. But legality gave way to practicality, and history, as ever, preferred the politically useful over the technically correct. Today, Lady Catherine Grey exists in a strange liminal space, neither fully tragic nor fully victorious. She was a woman of royal blood, who married for love, bore heirs in confinement, and may have inadvertently created an alternative line of succession that vanished in the fog of dynastic politics. Her story is a quiet mystery, one that hinges not on violence or betrayal, but on documents that never surfaced, and a ceremony that may or may not have happened. And while the Tower has seen many victims of ambition, Catherine's tale is perhaps the most quietly haunting. She wasn't executed, she wasn't exiled, she was just erased. But the bloodlines she left behind would ripple through English aristocracy for centuries. An invisible claim, always one heartbeat away from mattering again. And all of it, of course, hinged on a fragile thing: the death of one Tudor heir and the survival of another. Which leads us to another royal boy, another abrupt ending, and another question that has never truly been answered. What really killed Prince Arthur, the Tudor heir who wasn't meant to die? 16. Arthur, Prince of Wales. What actually killed Henry VII's heir? It was supposed to be a new beginning. When Prince Arthur, eldest son of King Henry VII and Elizabeth of York, was born in 1486, he embodied the end of civil war and the beginning of dynastic stability. His parents' union had symbolically united the houses of Lancaster and York, bringing the bloody Wars of the Roses to a close, or so everyone hoped. And Arthur? Arthur was the promise that the Tudor dynasty would last. Named for the legendary King of Camelot, born in the freshly secured aftermath of Bosworth Field, christened with pomp and paraded as the future of England, Prince Arthur was not just a royal child. He was a living symbol, a walking insurance policy. Tall, studious, politically trained from a young age, Arthur was the heir every paranoid king dreams of: dutiful, visible, and so far, healthy. Then he died. At 15 years old. Just 5 months after marrying Catherine of Aragon, the daughter of the most powerful monarchs in Europe. His sudden illness and death in April 1502 sent ripples through the Tudor court. Not just because it was tragic, but because it changed everything. And over 500 years later, no one can say for sure what killed him. To understand the stakes, you have to understand the context. By the turn of the 16th century, Henry VII had spent nearly 2 decades trying to cement his new dynasty. His marriage to Elizabeth of York had healed the fractured royal family, at least on paper, and their children were carefully groomed to embody the new order. Arthur, as the eldest, bore the weight of this delicate political balancing act. From infancy, he was titled Prince of Wales and raised apart from his siblings in a heavily managed environment at Ludlow Castle, where he acted as president of the Council of Wales and the Marches. He received a humanist education and training in kingship. His life was mapped out with precision. By 1501, the final piece was in place: a marriage alliance with Spain, then emerging as the dominant Catholic superpower in Europe. Arthur was married to Catherine of Aragon, daughter of Ferdinand of Aragon, and Isabella of Castile, in a lavish ceremony at St. Paul's Cathedral. The marriage was politically brilliant. It bound England to a powerful ally and elevated the Tudor dynasty's prestige. But the triumph was short-lived. In March 1502, just a few months into their marriage, Arthur and Catherine were residing at Ludlow when both reportedly fell ill. Catherine recovered. Arthur did not. On April 2nd, he died. Contemporary accounts are frustratingly vague. Chroniclers described him as being seized with a malign vapor, or a sickness which lasted 15 days. No detailed symptoms survive. No precise diagnosis exists. And so, over the centuries, the theories have accumulated. Some plausible, some fanciful, none confirmed. Let's review the leading suspects. This is the traditional explanation, favored by many Tudor historians. The English sweating sickness, a mysterious disease that struck England in waves during the late 15th and early 16th centuries, was known for its sudden onset and high mortality rate. Victims often died within hours. It particularly targeted young men of high status, a demographic that included Arthur. The problem? Arthur's illness reportedly lasted for over a week. That doesn't match the rapid fatality typical of sweating sickness. Unless, of course, his case was atypical, which is entirely possible since the illness remains poorly understood even today. Some medical historians have suggested it may have been a form of hantavirus or another rodent-borne virus. Others argue it might have been multiple diseases misclassified under a single name. Without physical remains to test, the theory remains speculative. Another leading candidate is tuberculosis, a disease with a slower progression, often affecting the lungs but capable of weakening a person over time and leading to fatal outcomes when combined with other infections. Arthur was described in some sources as physically frail, though this may be colored by posthumous bias. The problem, again, is lack of specificity. Tudor medical accounts often failed to distinguish between different types of fevers, infections, or chronic illnesses. Symptoms like heat, sweating, or melancholy could refer to almost anything. TB would fit some narratives, but contradict others. A more straightforward explanation is dysentery, typhoid fever, or another gastrointestinal infection. Common ailments in medieval and early modern courts, where sanitation was poor and water contamination rampant. These diseases could lead to prolonged illness and death, especially for someone weakened by stress or climate. Again, Catherine's recovery complicates the picture. If they were exposed to the same pathogen, why did she survive and he didn't? Was it a matter of personal health, or were they exposed to different sources of infection? Some have speculated that Arthur may have had a pre-existing health condition, perhaps congenital, that made him more susceptible to disease. Supporters of this theory point to the fact that his younger brother, Henry VIII, would go on to have a complex medical history of his own. But this line of inquiry leads into a broader set of assumptions about the Tudor bloodline, assumptions that often rely on a mixture of medical guesswork and historical personality analysis. And Arthur, unlike his infamous brother, left too short a record to analyze meaningfully. As with all royal deaths, especially sudden ones, there exists a thin trickle of conspiracy theory that suggests Arthur may have been deliberately removed, perhaps by factions who preferred Henry as heir, perhaps by opponents of the Spanish alliance, perhaps as part of an internal power struggle. There is no evidence for this, but it is telling that even with such a flimsy basis, the theory still circulates, because sudden royal deaths often beg for more dramatic explanations than the flu. What we do know is this: Arthur's death threw the Tudor succession into chaos. Catherine, now a teenage widow, was left in limbo. Henry VII was reluctant to return her dowry to Spain. The Spanish monarchs were reluctant to accept a failed alliance. And young Prince Henry, just 10 years old, suddenly became heir to the throne. Eventually, after years of diplomatic wrangling and papal paperwork, Henry would marry Catherine himself, an act that would ignite a chain of events so explosive it reshaped not just England, but Christendom. But back in 1502, none of that was visible. What was visible was a dead prince, a stunned court, and a question no one could answer. How does the future vanish this easily? Arthur's death remains one of those inflection points in history where a single life alters the course of nations, not through action, but through absence. Had Arthur lived, he likely would have become king. He and Catherine may have had children. The English Reformation, driven by his brother's obsession with producing a male heir, might never have happened. The monasteries might have remained intact. The Church of England might never have formed. The wives, the executions, the theological revolutions, all might have belonged to another timeline. But instead, we're left with the mystery of a young prince in a castle, dying quietly while the gears of empire shifted around him. And perhaps what makes it most haunting is that there is no villain here, no obvious hand behind the curtain, no easy blame. Just the terrifying randomness of illness, the fragility of succession, and the quiet end of a boy who had been trained to rule. And yet, the notion of legitimacy, always fragile in Tudor England, would rear its head again, this time not in a death, but in a birth. Because while Arthur's absence paved the way for Elizabeth I, her presence would always carry a question of her own. Was she ever legitimate at all? 17. Edward IV's legitimacy. Was the king himself a false Plantagenet? For a man who won the crown through brute force, charm, and battlefield brilliance, Edward IV never imagined that the most damaging threat to his reign would come not from his enemies, but from his mother's bedside. It's one of those whispers in royal history, low, scandalous, dangerous to say too loudly, but too tempting to ignore. That Edward, first Yorkist King of England, was not the biological son of Richard, Duke of York. That he was a changeling, a fraud in fine armor, born not of royal blood, but of another man's shadow. That the tall, golden warrior king whose victories helped end the Wars of the Roses might not have been a Plantagenet at all. It sounds like gossip. It may have been gossip. But for centuries, historians, genealogists, and opportunistic rebels have returned to this question. Because if it were true, even a little true, it would retroactively delegitimize not only Edward IV, but also his children, his brother Richard III, and his entire dynastic line. And in royal politics, nothing is more explosive than a paper-thin bloodline. Let's start with the basics. Edward IV was born in Rouen, Normandy in 1442, the second son of Richard, Duke of York, and Cecily Neville, a formidable noblewoman and political operator in her own right. Or at least, that's what the official genealogy says. But during Edward's lifetime, and more loudly after his death, rumors began to swirl that he was illegitimate. The stories claim that during the time of Edward's conception, his father was away on military campaign, nowhere near Rouen. That his mother, left behind, had a discreet affair. That Edward's true father might have been an archer, a courtier, a servant, or, depending on the account, some entirely different member of the nobility. The rumors, unsurprisingly, were most useful to Edward's enemies, and few deployed them more gleefully than his own brother. Yes, Richard III, the infamous, hunchbacked, Shakespeare-villainized king who seized the throne from Edward's sons, justified part of his claim by subtly invoking this very possibility. In 1483, Richard declared that Edward IV's children, the princes in the Tower, were illegitimate because of a pre-contract of marriage between Edward IV and another woman before he wed Elizabeth Woodville. But whispered beneath that legalese was something darker, that Edward himself might have had no legitimate claim to the throne to begin with. And here's where it gets delightfully medieval, because the source for this claim, surprisingly, was their own mother. Cecily Neville, Duchess of York, had a reputation for being proud, pious, and politically shrewd. According to one version of the rumor, it was she who first expressed doubts about Edward's paternity, possibly out of resentment, politics, or some inscrutable family feud. It's said that she favored Richard, her younger son, and saw in him the traits more befitting a king: seriousness, loyalty, conservatism. Edward, in contrast, was flamboyant, impulsive, a lover of show and spectacle. One chronicler, writing well after the fact, claimed that Cecily once tried to disown Edward's right to the throne during a tense family council, suggesting he was born of another man. If true, it's one of the most astonishing acts of dynastic sabotage in English history. If false, it's one of the most persistent character assassinations. Either way, the damage was done. The problem with this entire theory, of course, is that the timing doesn't quite line up. While some versions of the story claim that Richard of York was far from Rouen at the time of Edward's conception, modern historians have shown that this is not entirely accurate. The Duke may have been on campaign, but not necessarily so far as to make fatherhood impossible. In fact, records place him within reach of Cecily Neville during the likely window of conception. So if the physical logistics don't support the story, why does it keep returning? Because even if it wasn't true, it was useful. During the Wars of the Roses, legitimacy was a flexible currency. Everyone needed it, no one could fully prove it, and the lack of it was a political cudgel. Both the Lancastrians and Yorkists weaponized rumors, forged claims, and retrofitted genealogies. Allegations of illegitimacy, whether whispered about Edward IV, Henry VI, or the princes in the Tower, were less about truth than about narrative control. And Edward, for all his charisma and martial success, gave his enemies plenty of reasons to speculate. He was much taller than his supposed father or brothers, over 6 feet, a veritable giant for the time. His coloring was different. His temperament was wild. His secret marriage to Elizabeth Woodville, a widowed commoner with Lancastrian ties, alienated his nobility and raised questions about his judgment. His court was glittering but volatile, full of factions and rivalries. These traits didn't prove anything, but they felt suspicious. And in royal politics, feeling often outweighed fact. But here's where things twist again. If Edward IV was illegitimate, then so were his sons. That includes Edward V, the boy king who disappeared into the Tower. And if Edward V had no claim, then Richard III's usurpation was not a usurpation at all. It was a restoration, a cleanup job, a legitimate correction of a dynastic mistake. That's precisely the narrative Richard's allies tried to promote. But history, as always, resists being neatened. Richard's reign ended in battle. The Tudors arrived, married into the Yorkist line, and quickly set about burying the question, literally and figuratively. Henry VII destroyed documents, repealed inconvenient statutes, and silenced voices. His marriage to Elizabeth of York, Edward IV's daughter, was supposed to unify the warring factions. But if Edward IV wasn't truly Yorkist royal blood, then Henry VII's heirs were not truly Yorkist either. So the legitimacy of all the Tudor monarchs, including Henry VIII and Elizabeth I, is entangled in this single genetic mystery. And modern science? Could it solve it? Possibly. In recent years, Y chromosome DNA testing has been proposed to settle the matter once and for all. If Edward IV's male line descendants show a different Y DNA profile than other confirmed Plantagenets, such as Richard III, whose remains were famously identified in 2012, it might suggest a break in the line. And here's the twist. Preliminary results already hint at a possible mismatch between Richard III and descendants of the supposed male line of Edward III, which means, somewhere along the way, a royal cuckoo may indeed have slipped into the nest. Was it Edward IV? Was it someone earlier? We don't know, but we do know this. The English crown, for all its ceremony and sanctity, may rest on a foundation of convenient forgetfulness, and Edward IV, the dazzling, victorious king who took the throne twice, crushed rebellion, and presided over a golden court, may have carried a secret that even he didn't know. That his bloodline was borrowed, his reign was built on charm and battle, and his legacy might not be his at all. But if royal myths thrive on presence, they unravel with absence. And in the next royal enigma, it's the lack of something, a child, a dynasty, a future, that would shake the crown to its core. Because when Queen Mary promised an heir, the kingdom waited, and watched her belly swell, until it didn't. 18. Mary's false pregnancies. Illness, misdiagnosis, or political theater. In the grand pageant of Tudor spectacle, few events were as anticipated, and as catastrophically anticlimactic as the pregnancies of Mary Wood. She was the first crowned queen regnant in English history. The daughter of Henry VIII and Catherine of Aragon, her legitimacy had been contested, her mother exiled, her own name erased from the succession, only to be restored at the last minute by her younger brother's rapidly failing body. Against all odds, Mary Tudor had taken the throne. But it was what came next that history finds far more mysterious than her victory. Because once she was queen, all anyone could think about was her womb. For a regime as tenuous and brittle as Mary's, an heir wasn't just desirable, it was the linchpin. The difference between the fragile flowering of her reign and its utter collapse. The stakes were generational. Produce a child and the Catholic restoration she had begun might continue. Fail, and everything she built might collapse with her. It was, in essence, a biological succession crisis disguised as a religious one. So when Mary announced in 1554, barely a year into her reign, that she was pregnant, England exhaled. It was precisely the narrative her kingdom needed. A queen with child, a new Tudor on the way, a Catholic heir to seal the reversal of Protestant reforms. But what followed was not a celebration. It was a slow, spiraling enigma that would haunt the remainder of her life, and leave scholars 5 centuries later still asking, was she ever pregnant at all? Let's walk through the timeline, and then through the theories. In the summer of 1554, Mary's marriage to Philip of Spain, a deeply unpopular alliance in England, but a strategic one, had taken place. By autumn, rumors of a pregnancy were already circulating. Mary's stomach was swelling. Her appetite had changed. Her periods had reportedly stopped. Royal proclamations began to prepare the kingdom for the birth. By April 1555, a chamber was prepared at Hampton Court for her confinement, a traditional seclusion period before childbirth. Foreign ambassadors sent glowing reports home. Midwives were put on alert. Parliament began drafting plans for how the realm would be governed during the Queen's supposed recovery. And then, nothing happened. Days passed. Weeks passed. The court grew anxious. May came and went. Then June. By July, hopes were fading. Some whispered that the child had died in the womb. Others suggested the pregnancy had been miscalculated. By August, the Queen emerged from confinement, noticeably thinner, exhausted, and, crucially, still without a child. There was no formal announcement, just silence. A couple of years later, in 1557, Mary again showed signs of pregnancy. Her health fluctuated. She again ceased appearing in public. This time, perhaps out of caution or embarrassment, the preparations were more muted. There was no elaborate announcement, no confinement ceremony. But court officials again began to act as though a birth might be imminent. Again, no child came. This time, the episode ended not just in disappointment, but in decline. Mary's health deteriorated rapidly throughout 1558. She died in November of that year at age 42, possibly of cancer or another systemic illness. She left no heir. The throne passed to Elizabeth I, the very sister whose legitimacy Mary had tried so fiercely to invalidate. And the mystery of the pregnancies? Still unresolved. So what happened? How could 2 apparent pregnancies, publicly supported, medically described, politically mobilized, result in nothing? Were they ever pregnancies at all? Here are the 3 leading theories. The most accepted modern interpretation is that Mary suffered from a gynecological or endocrine disorder, such as ovarian cysts, fibroids, or possibly even uterine cancer. Conditions that can mimic pregnancy symptoms, especially in an era with no diagnostic imaging or hormonal tests. Symptoms like abdominal swelling, nausea, missed periods, and hormonal changes could easily be misunderstood even by physicians. Some historians believe the second pregnancy may have been a manifestation of the same underlying condition that ultimately caused her death, In an era when even common illnesses were poorly understood, and when royal doctors were often chosen more for loyalty than for accuracy, a misdiagnosis would not be surprising. And in Mary's case, doctors may have been under immense pressure to confirm what everyone so desperately wanted to believe. Another theory posits that Mary experienced what's known as pseudocyesis, a rare psychological condition in which a woman believes herself to be pregnant and exhibits many of the physical signs, despite there being no fetus. Pseudocyesis is still recognized today and can include symptoms such as swollen belly, weight gain, cessation of menstruation, nausea, and even sensations of fetal movement. This theory draws support from the immense psychological pressure Mary faced. Her identity, her religious mission, and her dynasty all hinged on producing a child. Her entire court, indeed the entire realm, wanted and needed her to be pregnant. It's not unthinkable that, under such strain, her mind and body could have conspired to create the illusion. And in Tudor England, where physical proof of pregnancy was ambiguous and rarely questioned until birth, it could have gone unchallenged for months. A more cynical reading suggests the pregnancies were not misdiagnoses at all, but rather intentional political fabrications designed to buy Mary time or stave off instability. This interpretation is controversial and rests more on circumstantial evidence than direct proof, but it's based on a realpolitik logic. Announcing a pregnancy, even falsely, could help pacify opposition, delay succession planning, and distract from religious unrest. It's worth noting that both pregnancies came at politically sensitive moments. The first followed her unpopular marriage to Philip, and the second coincided with renewed tensions in England's religious landscape and a disastrous war with France. A coming child, especially a male heir, could have served as a rallying point for a fragile regime. But there's little to suggest Mary herself would have played such a role willingly. She was devout, sincere, and emotionally earnest. A deliberate hoax feels out of character for a woman whose greatest political weakness was her inflexibility, not her manipulation. Still, even if Mary wasn't consciously deceiving, the machinery of court politics might have moved ahead of her. Once the rumors started, it may have become politically impossible to walk them back. What's striking is how these mysteries didn't simply affect one woman, they rewrote the course of a kingdom. If Mary had borne a child, especially a son, Elizabeth Thursters might never have ruled. The Protestant Reformation in England could have been reversed permanently. England might have remained tethered to Spain and the Catholic world. There might have been no Shakespeare, no British Empire, no colonial experiments in the Americas. Instead, Mary died childless, and the throne passed to her younger sister, the Protestant icon who would redefine England for a generation. And Mary? Her legacy became a cautionary tale. She was labeled Bloody Mary, remembered more for her persecutions than her policies, her failures more than her fervor. But buried under the moral judgments and the polemical nicknames is this haunting, intimate mystery. The queen who promised a future and delivered a silence. And in that silence, a deeper fear lingered, the fear that a dynasty might vanish not through bloodshed or conquest, but through the soft vanishing point of an empty crib. Which, of course, brings us to another royal figure, not yet king, whose own identity and claim to the throne would be questioned not because of what he didn't produce, but because of who he claimed to be. Because in the next chapter of Royal Doubt, we're left asking, was Lambert Simnel a prince, or just a name in borrowed robes? 19. The Death of the Prince's Pretender. Lambert Simnel. Who was he really claiming to be? In a world where identity meant power, and power meant survival, few gambits were as dangerous, or as oddly successful, as the case of Lambert Simnel. He was either a pawn or a prince, a symbol or a symptom. A teenage boy who either walked onto the stage of English history as a carefully schooled royal heir, or as a passably convincing decoy, wrapped in borrowed bloodlines and paraded like a ghost of Plantagenet glory. It's a story most often overshadowed by his better-known counterpart, Perkin Warbeck, but in many ways, Simnel's rise, and his strange, quiet fall, is even more peculiar. Because while most royal pretenders fade away in the smoke of execution or exile, Lambert Simnel was spared, employed, absorbed. And more than 5 centuries later, we're still not entirely sure who he was trying to be, or who truly believed him. To begin, we must wind back to 1487, just 2 years into the reign of Henry VII, founder of the Tudor dynasty and veteran of the blood-soaked chessboard that was the Wars of the Roses. Henry's claim to the throne was thin, politically stitched together through victory at Bosworth, marriage to Elizabeth of York, and some strategic myth-making. He needed his enemies to be quiet, his claim to be clean, and any lingering Yorkist threats to vanish into the mist. They didn't. Enter Lambert Simnel. The core mystery of Simnel's story lies in this seemingly simple question: who was he pretending to be? The traditional answer is Edward, Earl of Warwick, the young son of George, Duke of Clarence, and therefore the nephew of both Edward IV and Richard III. After Bosworth, the real Warwick had been locked away in the Tower of London, a silent and politically dangerous child whose mere existence could rally Yorkist loyalists. So when news spread that Warwick had escaped and was raising an army to challenge Henry VII, it struck the crown like a thunderclap. In a time when facial recognition meant he looks like his uncle, and genealogy was something you performed with your mouth rather than a microscope, it didn't take much to convince people. But there's a twist, or several. Though the common line is that Simnel impersonated Warwick, some sources from the time and after suggest a confused or shifting narrative. In early versions of the conspiracy, Simnel may have been said to be Richard, Duke of York, one of the vanished princes in the Tower. Other sources refer to him more vaguely as a lost Yorkist prince. Still others treat the identity as fluid, molded to suit the ambitions of his handlers. One of those handlers was Richard Simons, an Oxford-trained priest who allegedly discovered Lambert and educated him in courtly manners and noble speech. Whether Simons found a boy who looked like Warwick or trained one to act the part remains uncertain. But it was Simons who pulled the strings and who would later claim that Simnel had first been intended to impersonate Richard of York, only to pivot to Warwick when political winds changed. If true, it suggests something more than a simple imposture. It suggests that identity itself was being weaponized, that it was less about truth and more about narrative convenience. After all, a child claimant was a canvas, not a character. And the rebellion took off. Simnel, accompanied by Yorkist exiles and backed by Margaret of Burgundy, Edward IV's sister, sailed to Ireland, a traditional Plantagenet stronghold, where, incredibly, he was crowned as King Edward VI in Dublin. Not just proclaimed, but literally crowned with a makeshift diadem in a full coronation ceremony. It was pure political theater, and it worked. From there, Simnel and his army, which included seasoned foreign mercenaries and Irish troops, invaded England. The campaign ended in June 1487 at the Battle of Stokefield, often seen as the final battle of the Wars of the Roses. Henry VII's forces won decisively. The rebellion was crushed. Key Yorkist leaders were killed. And Simnel? He was captured and spared. Here's where the mystery deepens. Henry VII, no stranger to political threats, made a surprising choice. He put Lambert Simnel to work in the royal kitchens. Later, Simnel may have become a falconer in the royal household. He lived, quietly, anonymously, without execution, trial, or much further inquiry. Why? Some argue it was pure PR strategy. By sparing the boy and treating him like a harmless puppet, Henry could delegitimize the entire rebellion. Look, he was effectively saying, my enemies just crowned a kitchen boy. That's how desperate they are. Others believe Henry genuinely saw Simnel as a tool, not a mastermind. After all, the real threat had been the network of nobles and exiles behind him, not the boy himself. But there's another angle, rarely explored but more disturbing. What if there was just enough ambiguity around Simnel's identity to make execution too risky? We know that the real Edward, Earl of Warwick, was locked in the Tower at the time. But in an era without photographs, without live broadcasts, without widespread literacy, proving that your prisoner was the real one was harder than it sounds. Henry responded to the rebellion by parading the real Warwick through the streets of London after the battle, an obvious PR countermeasure. But consider the optics. You don't parade a real prince unless people have reason to doubt he's alive. It suggests that even Henry recognized how fragile public certainty could be. Could Simons or his backers have believed they were using the real Warwick? Could Simnel himself have believed it? Or more intriguingly, could there have been just enough uncertainty in the chaos of the post-Ricardian world to make the claim stick, at least briefly? No one really knows what Simnel believed. He never spoke publicly. He never wrote a memoir. He simply faded into the background, a forgotten cog in a dynastic machine. But he left behind a precedent. He proved that royal identity was vulnerable, malleable, performable, and terrifyingly easy to fabricate in the right hands. He showed that all it took was a boy, a name, and the right backers to throw a kingdom into civil war. And perhaps that's why, when another prince in the Tower emerged a few years later, this time named Perkin Warbeck, claiming to be Richard of York, people didn't just laugh him off, because Simnel had already taught them the terrifying lesson. Sometimes, the crown can rest on a face no one recognizes. And as we follow that thread further, the next mystery doesn't just ask whether someone was who they said they were. It asks who else knew, and how far the state was willing to go to keep the truth sealed behind the walls of the Tower. 20. Anne Boleyn's pre-contract and the legitimacy of Elizabeth research, legal reality or political weapon. When a kingdom stands on the word legitimate, it only takes a whisper to crack the throne. And no monarch understood this better, too late perhaps, than Elizabeth I, the self-styled virgin queen whose father split Christendom in half just to see her born. She reigned for 45 years, transformed England into a global power, and became an icon of statecraft and poetic defiance. And yet, even as she thundered across history, there remained a lingering technicality, an unresolved legal knot from a decade before her birth that threatened to unravel the whole tapestry. Was Elizabeth, daughter of Henry VIII and Anne Boleyn, ever truly legitimate? The question turns on something deceptively obscure, a pre-contract. A supposed secret earlier marriage between Anne Boleyn and a man named Henry Percy, 6th Earl of Northumberland, that, if proven true, would have rendered Anne's later union with the king invalid, and by extension, any child of that union, illegitimate. In a lesser case, this might have been a footnote. But this wasn't just a royal soap opera. This was the legal framework upon which the entire Tudor succession rested. Elizabeth's very right to rule hung on whether a long-dead earl once promised himself to a future queen. So let's trace this legal landmine, not for its drama, though it has plenty, but for what it reveals about how monarchy turns on paperwork, and how truth, in royal hands, is more often manufactured than discovered. Before Anne Boleyn ever caught the full, lethal attention of Henry VIII, she had been part of the Queen's household, young, ambitious, and politically shrewd. During this time, she was closely associated with Henry Percy, heir to one of England's most powerful northern families. The two were rumored to be romantically involved. Some sources suggest they were formally betrothed, which, under canon law, could constitute a binding promise of marriage, potentially as good as wed. But Henry Percy broke things off, or rather, his father and Cardinal Wolsey intervened, allegedly on Henry VIII's own orders. Percy was then quickly married off to someone else, and Anne was, for a time, removed from court. Years later, she returned, and the rest is royal Reformation history. When Henry VIII sought to divorce his first wife, Catherine of Aragon, in order to marry Anne, he blew up England's religious ties to Rome. The Pope refused. So Henry declared himself supreme head of the Church of England, broke with Rome, and legalized his new marriage through a newly minted ecclesiastical structure. It was, functionally, a self-marriage, and the legitimacy of his children would henceforth rely on the king's new authority rather than papal approval. But the old legal frameworks didn't disappear overnight. The rumor of Anne's previous contract with Percy lingered in the background, and it came back at a very specific and politically opportune moment. In 1536, just 3 years after marrying Henry, Anne Boleyn fell spectacularly from grace. She was accused of adultery, incest, and treason, a suite of charges that have long been debated, discredited, and reinterpreted. But alongside those more salacious accusations was another, quieter claim, that she had never been legally married to the king in the first place. This is where the pre-contract with Percy reappears. During Anne's arrest and trial, Crown officials dredged up the old rumor, seemingly to bolster the case that Elizabeth was illegitimate and Anne had no rightful place as queen. Percy was summoned and questioned under oath. He denied that there had been any formal pre-contract. That should have ended it. But denial in Tudor England was rarely the end of anything, because the goal wasn't just to end Anne, it was to erase her. Her marriage was declared invalid. Her daughter Elizabeth was declared illegitimate by Act of Parliament. The Crown moved swiftly to construct a new version of the past, in which Anne had never been a valid queen, and Elizabeth had never been a valid heir. Henry, meanwhile, married Jane Seymour 11 days after Anne's execution, as if to prove that legitimacy could be reinvented, again and again, with every ring he slipped onto a new hand. The deeper mystery here is that none of this had to do with truth in a conventional sense. It had to do with legal narrative control. If Henry VIII could marry, annul, legitimize, or bastardize children by statute, then legitimacy became a function of power, not law. And yet, these power moves left residue. When Elizabeth came to the throne in 1558, after the deaths of her brother Edward and her sister Mary, her legitimacy was still officially in question. The act that declared her a bastard had not been repealed. Parliament had never reversed the annulment of Henry's marriage to Anne. She was queen by will, by necessity, by political consent, but not, strictly speaking, by consistent legal framework. Elizabeth's solution? Ignore it. She refused to reopen the question. She never asked Parliament to formally restore her legitimacy. She didn't need to. Her rule would be based on performance, not paperwork. But her enemies remembered. Catholic Europe never acknowledged her as the rightful monarch. Papal bulls declared her a heretic usurper. Her cousin, Mary, Queen of Scots, was seen by many as the legitimate Queen of England by blood. And at home, the question of succession remained fraught. Elizabeth never married, never named an heir, and never formally addressed the strange paradox of her own claim. The ghost of the pre-contract and of the laws that rendered her a bastard remained unburied. Because to dig into them would be to admit that her reign was stitched together by the very tools she later disavowed. Parliamentary manipulation, ecclesiastical sleight of hand, and the selective reading of canon law. The mystery of Anne Boleyn's pre-contract isn't just a curiosity. It's a case study in how royal legitimacy is constructed, manipulated, and weaponized. Whether or not the pre-contract was real, and evidence suggests it likely was not, its political utility was vast. It allowed Henry VIII to remove Anne without invalidating himself. It allowed Elizabeth's enemies to question her reign without firing a shot. It allowed law to masquerade as morality, and morality to be edited, repealed, or ignored. More importantly, it underscores a deeper Tudor paradox, that the dynasty built on controlling legitimacy never escaped it. Every heir was suspect, every birth was a battleground, and every act of succession was shadowed by some earlier piece of manipulated law. And so Elizabeth, perhaps the most effective monarch of her line, was born under a legal question mark, a punctuation mark no amount of propaganda could fully erase. But if legitimacy could be denied through paperwork, it could also be erased through silence. And that brings us to a man whose children were never questioned, not because they were proven legitimate, but because they were officially invisible. Because the next mystery isn't about a queen or even a crown, but about the most powerful king of the age and the heirs he never wanted to talk about. So, how many illegitimate children did Henry VIII really have? And how many slipped through the cracks of history, deliberately unacknowledged, carefully obscured, or simply erased before they could matter? 21. Henry VIII's hidden heirs. How many illegitimate children did he really have? In a kingdom where inheritance defined power and bloodlines decided the fate of empires, few things were more politically volatile than a royal child born out of wedlock. Unless, of course, that child was born to Henry VIII. The man had 6 wives. That part you know. But those 6 high-profile marriages have long distracted from a quieter, more elusive question that has haunted Tudor historians for centuries. How many illegitimate children did Henry VIII really have? He publicly acknowledged only one, Henry Fitzroy, Duke of Richmond. But court gossip, ambassadorial letters, household payments, suspicious appointments, and the cryptic silences of Tudor record-keeping suggest that Fitzroy may have been just the tip of the iceberg. This mystery doesn't involve a lost heir rising to reclaim the crown. No buried princes or royal doubles storming castles. It's stranger than that. This mystery of children who may have existed, may even have been known to the king himself, but were carefully erased from history before they could matter. Because for Henry VIII, perhaps the most notorious monarch in English history, illegitimacy was more than a moral question. It was a political liability, and one that had to be carefully managed, rewritten, or buried depending on the moment. And centuries later, we still don't know how many of his children disappeared into the background of court life, passed off as nobles, concealed behind generous stipends or obscure titles, never to be acknowledged in public, because to name them would be to destabilize everything. So let's begin with what we do know. Born in 1519 to Elizabeth Blount, one of Henry's early mistresses and a lady-in-waiting to Catherine of Aragon, Henry Fitzroy was the only illegitimate child the king ever publicly acknowledged. And not just acknowledged, he elevated him. Fitzroy was given the title Duke of Richmond and Somerset at age 6, an extraordinary honor for a child with no legal claim to the throne. He was given lavish estates, a prominent household, and even considered, briefly, as a potential heir presumptive during a time when Catherine had failed to produce a surviving son. Fitzroy died at 17, possibly of tuberculosis, before the succession crisis could come to a head. But his existence proves one essential point. Henry VIII was willing to legitimize a child born out of wedlock when it suited him, which means that any others left unacknowledged weren't necessarily unknown. They were, more likely, unwanted complications. Court gossip is unreliable by nature, but it's rarely baseless. Throughout Henry's reign, both foreign ambassadors and domestic courtiers circulated rumors of other illegitimate children. Most of these alleged offspring are known only by suggestive patterns, unexplained gifts, sudden noble appointments, or the quiet elevation of individuals with no clear lineage. Let's look at a few of the more frequently named suspects. Thomas Stukely. A swashbuckling adventurer and soldier, Stukely was known for boasting that he was the son of Henry VIII. While no official recognition ever supported the claim, his rapid rise, access to court, and unusual political opportunities have raised eyebrows. Some historians dismiss his claims as self-serving lies. Others argue that even if the story was exaggerated, it had to come from somewhere. He eventually fell out of favor, went abroad, and died in battle. But the rumor stuck. Ethelreda Malty. A lesser-known figure, Ethelreda was the daughter of John Malty, a tailor closely associated with Henry. Some records suggest she may have actually been fathered by the king, with Malta acting as a cover guardian. She received land and money from the crown, and her placement in elite circles was curiously disproportionate to her apparent status. No smoking gun confirms her paternity, but the circumstantial evidence, timing, payments, silence, is suspiciously dense. John Perrot. Perhaps the most compelling claimant, Sir John Perrot was a prominent courtier and soldier, whose resemblance to Henry VIII was noted by multiple contemporaries. He was elevated rapidly, served in high office under Elizabeth I, and, crucially, was rumored by some to be Henry's son. Modern historians remain split. There's no firm documentary proof. But as with others, the absence of acknowledgement doesn't equal the absence of paternity. In fact, given the king's volatile relationship with legitimacy, the lack of public recognition may be more telling than anything. If Henry VIII fathered other children, and many scholars believe he did, why not acknowledge them? The answer lies in the brutal, brittle architecture of Tudor politics. For a man so obsessed with producing a legitimate male heir, acknowledging illegitimate ones was a contradiction. It drew attention to his marital failures. It exposed the weakness of his succession. And it invited rivals, rumors, and instability at every turn. Acknowledging Fitzroy had been useful. He was male, healthy, and born during a politically advantageous moment. But once Henry remarried and hoped for legitimate sons, even Fitzroy became a threat to the preferred narrative. His death in 1536 was a quiet relief to the question of whether an illegitimate heir might claim the throne. For the others, recognition would be a gamble with little reward. Best to keep them close or keep them quiet. And there's another factor, Anne Boleyn. By the time Henry was elevating Fitzroy, Anne had already positioned herself as the woman who would give him a true heir. Her faction was not eager to see public reminders of Henry's previous dalliances or his willingness to blur marital lines. Acknowledging bastards didn't just risk court gossip, it risked Anne's own carefully constructed narrative. Later, during Henry's marriages to Jane Seymour, Anne of Cleves, Catherine Howard, and Catherine Parr, there was little political will or personal incentive to revisit the bastard issue. The focus was always on legitimacy, legacy, and lawful heirs. Anything that muddied those waters was quietly swept away. One of the most frustrating features of this mystery is that Tudor records are selectively rich. The Crown was excellent at documenting what it wanted preserved, and equally skilled at allowing other things to quietly vanish. Payment records sometimes hint at generous stipends for unknown individuals. Court rolls occasionally show unconnected names receiving sudden access to royal lands or titles. But the lack of explicit labels means that historians are forced to read between the lines, not for what is said, but for what is implied and left out. In a world where royal identity was a matter of state security, intentional omission was as powerful as public proclamation. If definitive proof were ever discovered, a document, a DNA match, a hidden letter, it wouldn't just add a name to the Tudor family tree. It would reshape how we understand Henry VIII, his reign, and his court culture. The man obsessed with securing his dynasty, who broke from Rome and remade English religion for want of a male heir, might have had multiple male heirs hiding in plain sight, ignored, discarded, or politically inconvenient. It would cast a new light on the rise of Elizabeth I, whose own legitimacy was repeatedly challenged. It would deepen our understanding of court factionalism, succession paranoia, and the quiet, chilling efficiency with which the Tudors could make people, even royal children, disappear from the record without a trace. And it would force us to confront the reality that in Tudor England, blood meant everything, but only when it was convenient. Because sometimes, a royal child wasn't declared illegitimate because they weren't the king's. They were declared illegitimate because they were, and someone else had better plans. But not all vanishing royal children were swept away by scandal. Some disappeared under far murkier, more systemic circumstances. Before the Tudors perfected the art of dynastic invisibility, the Plantagenets and Lancastrians left their own trail of missing royal heirs. obscured by war, wardship, and quiet political exits. Which leads us to the next mystery. Not one child, but a pattern of royal disappearances. The early eerie echoes of the princes in the tower, long before there was a tower. 22. The disappearance of the little princes of the House of Lancaster, earlier medieval parallels. Long before the Tudors made royal succession a high-stakes blood sport, the English crown had already developed a troubling habit, losing children. Not in the modern sense, of course. There were no medieval milk cartons, no castle-wide searches, no tearful public pleas. These children weren't misplaced, they were strategically misplaced. Disappeared not by accident, but by design. Removed from the line of sight of history for reasons that, even now, remain unsettlingly opaque. They were young, noble, and politically inconvenient. They were the lost heirs of the House of Lancaster, and no one ever found out what really happened to most of them. Let's be clear, this isn't a single locked-room mystery. There is no Tower of London, no suspicious uncle with a crown, no skeletons discovered centuries later. Instead, what we have is a pattern, a strange recurring motif in which royal or near-royal boys from the 13th and 14th centuries seem to evaporate during moments of dynastic stress. Their fates were not recorded, or were recorded in the kind of dry administrative language that obscures more than it reveals. They were hostages, wards, or political chess pieces. And then, they weren't. It's the sort of disappearance that happens not with a scream, but with a shuffle of parchment. So who were these little princes of an earlier age, and why did the system keep letting them slip away? The House of Lancaster didn't begin as a royal branch, but it got there soon enough. Descended from John of Gaunt, fourth son of Edward III, the Lancastrians gained the throne in 1399, when Henry Bolingbroke deposed his cousin Richard II. That act, cloaked in political necessity and justified with elaborate legal wrangling, was still, at its core, a usurpation. And once the precedent had been set that kings could be replaced by slightly more muscular cousins, dangerous game began. Usurpation creates instability. Instability breeds paranoia. And paranoia makes children a liability, especially royal ones. Take, for example, the sons of Thomas of Lancaster, or the ward heirs of noble houses loyal to Richard II, or the obscure descendants of sidelined Plantagenet claimants. Many of these boys were placed in the care of the crown, not fostered, kept, not protected, contained. And in several documented cases they simply vanish from the record. Sometimes they were recorded as dying young, a suspiciously convenient fact, often unsupported by burial records or contemporary mourning. Sometimes their trail ends in a wardship account, an incomplete financial document that tells you who received funding for their care, but not where they went next. There's no smoking sword, no confession, no scandalous chronicler's tale, just silence, archival absences, a series of what happened to him that never quite gets an answer, and that, perhaps, is what makes it so eerie. In medieval England, the monarchy had a very particular relationship with children. They were potential futures, and that made them threats. Boys born into noble houses with claims to the throne were often taken as wards of the crown, a practice that doubled as financial management and political insurance. On paper, it was benign. The king had the right to oversee the upbringing and marriages of underage heirs, especially those whose inheritance came with land or military obligations. In practice, it was surveillance with legal backing. The crown could place a boy in the household of a loyal noble, far from his own family. It could prevent him from marrying a powerful heiress. It could delay his inheritance. Or, as some suspect, it could simply make him disappear. No scandal, no spectacle, just a young lord who never came of age and whose memory quietly faded. Some historians chalk these cases up to record loss. After all, medieval documents are fragmentary. Plagues swept through noble houses. Wars destabilized institutions. Not every death made it into the official ledgers. But even with these allowances, the pattern is too consistent to ignore. When succession was stable, these children lived. When it wasn't, they vanished. It's not hard to understand the motive. A young heir, especially one related to a previous king, could become a figurehead for rebellion. It didn't matter whether he wanted the throne, others might want it for him. And if you're the king or the king's minister, what do you do with a 9-year-old boy whose name alone could rally a faction? You can't try him for treason. You can't accuse him of conspiracy. He's just a child. But if he were to die in custody, of illness, of natural causes, of no cause at all, because no one bothered to write it down, well, that would solve a great many problems, and no one would be in a position to ask too many questions, because the only witnesses were the people tasked with keeping him hidden in the first place. One of the more compelling recurring features of this mystery is the wardship system itself. It was, effectively, state-sanctioned hostage-taking. The king profited from it financially. He could sell wardships to his favorites or hold them personally. But it was also a way to keep potentially dangerous bloodlines under watch. Sometimes the children reappeared as adults, neutered politically, married off to loyal allies. But sometimes their records simply stopped. These weren't paupers. These were the sons of earls and barons, boys whose names should have appeared in property deeds, military rosters, legal disputes, or marriage contracts. And yet, nothing. No grave, no scandal, just a missing line in a genealogy chart. In many ways, this mystery is less about individual cases than about a systemic truth, that the monarchy of medieval England developed quiet mechanisms of elimination, not the dramatic executions of later reigns, not the theatrical treason trials or public decapitations, but disappearances that didn't need headlines. In a world where legitimacy was everything, but birthright was dangerous, sometimes it was easiest to remove the child before he became a threat. No law needed to be broken. No sword needed to be drawn. Just keep him out of sight. Keep him out of the records. Wait for memory to do the rest. We tend to think of historical mysteries as puzzles with missing pieces. But this one is more like a stage with the cast missing. We know the structure. We see the shadows. But the children themselves never speak. They're a kind of medieval negative space, known only by what was once expected of them, and what never happened. And in the silence of the archives, their absence whispers a truth that still resonates. That power often survives not by crowning the right person, but by ensuring no one else is left standing. Which brings us, quite literally, to the next great plague on royal succession, the enemy you couldn't predict and often couldn't prevent. Because before Henry VIII ever lost a wife to childbirth or a son to fever, a far more mysterious killer stalked his court. One so fast, so terrifying, and so selective that it seemed almost supernatural. The disease that killed Tudor royals in days, sometimes hours, and left no trace but fear. And no, we still don't know what it was. 23. The true nature of the sweating sickness that haunted Tudor royals. In an age of plagues and pestilence, one particular illness managed to terrify both the court and the commoner alike. It didn't linger like the Black Death or unfold in visible sores and weeping wounds. It came fast. It came silent. And then it left, usually taking its victims with it. This was not a disease that announced itself slowly. It was one that struck in the morning and buried its victims by nightfall. And if you were unlucky enough to be born into the Tudor elite, your odds weren't much better than the peasant in the field. It was called the sweating sickness, and it terrified Tudor England. But despite its reach, its speed, and the panic it inspired from royal courts to university halls, we still don't know what it actually was. And yes, it is still a mystery. The first recorded outbreak of the sweating sickness hit England in 1485, the same year Henry VII won the crown at the Battle of Bosworth. That timing alone has led some to speculate, darkly and perhaps poetically, that the disease arrived as a kind of royal curse, an omen attached to a dynasty born in blood and battlefield luck. From the start, the sickness had peculiar preferences. It was notoriously selective. Unlike the bubonic plague, which ravaged the poorest districts, the sweating sickness often targeted the wealthy, the educated, and the well-fed. Nobles, courtiers, young men at Oxford and Cambridge, members of Parliament, even kings' own households. It had an unsettling social signature. It killed the people who were supposed to be safest. One of its most famous victims was Henry VIII's elder brother, Arthur, Prince of Wales, whose death at Ludlow Castle in 1502 remains one of the greatest what-ifs in royal history. Though other diagnoses have been suggested, like tuberculosis or another respiratory infection, many historians have linked his sudden death to the symptoms consistent with sweating sickness. And as we know, Arthur's death left a vacancy in the Tudor succession that Henry VIII would fill with all the religious and dynastic fireworks that followed. Not that the disease was finished with the Tudors. It returned in sporadic but devastating waves, most notably in 1528, when it tore through London and forced Henry VIII to retreat from court in fear. Letters from the period show the king sending his courtiers away in different directions, trying to avoid clustering them together, as if disease could be dodged by spatial management. He even moved his queen, Anne Boleyn, to another residence for her safety, though that didn't prevent several of her servants from dying in rapid succession. The disease never learned manners. It didn't respect palaces. It didn't respond to fasting, prayer, or the high walls of privilege. And then, around the mid-1500s, it just stopped. Or did it? Descriptions from the time are frustratingly vague by modern standards, but consistent in their terror. The disease began with a sense of unease, followed by chills, fever, extreme sweating, rapid heartbeat, and an overwhelming sense of impending doom. Victims would often collapse within an hour or two of the first symptoms. Many were dead within 3 to 18 hours. Some never even made it past the initial sweat. There was no rash, no distinctive lesion, no easy way to track its progression except through the fever chart of panic that followed it from town to town. And here's where it gets stranger. No one knew how it spread. It didn't always follow trade routes, and it sometimes spared entire regions. There were no rats carrying fleas, no festering wounds to analyze. And because it passed so quickly and left behind so little evidence, it became as much a psychological affliction as a medical one. People were afraid to touch each other, to breathe the same air, to stay in town when rumors began. It was a disease that didn't just kill, it disrupted, and, like a well-trained political rumor, it needed no clear origin to cause chaos. Modern scientists and historians have tried again and again to retroactively diagnose the sweating sickness. Theories include hantavirus pulmonary syndrome. This is one of the most popular modern candidates. Hantaviruses are rodent-borne and can cause a fast-moving illness with similar symptoms. The problem? The transmission vectors and timing don't always line up with the disease's behavior. An aggressive form of influenza, possible given the flu's ability to mutate and the similarities in onset, but most influenza strains have a longer incubation period. Sweating sickness was far more immediate. Anthrax or ergotism. These have been floated, but neither quite fits the profile. The speed, the lack of obvious environmental factors, and the disease's disappearance don't match the expected patterns. A unique and now extinct pathogen. This is the most unsettling possibility, that the sweating sickness was its own disease, one that either burned itself out or mutated beyond recognition. Whatever it was, its ability to vanish is part of the puzzle. The last confirmed outbreak occurred in 1551. After that, it never returned in its original form. Some link it to later European outbreaks of a disease called the English sweat, but even those seem diluted, less fatal, less exact. The original monster disappeared. But the fear remained. In a world without modern medicine, illness wasn't just biology, It was moral commentary. The fact that the disease targeted nobility led to uncomfortable spiritual questions. Was this God's punishment? Was the new Tudor regime cursed? Was the court too decadent, too impure, too ambitious? It didn't help that the disease sometimes followed political transitions. The 1485 outbreak occurred just as Henry VII seized power. The 1528 wave came during Henry VIII's most turbulent marital rearrangements. It all felt a little symbolic, and when a disease is both unexplainable and poetic, it becomes something bigger than a medical mystery. It becomes mythic, a kind of divine editorial note on power, ambition, and mortality. You didn't survive sweating sickness by luck. You survived by favor, or at least, that's how many saw it. And if you died, maybe that said something about your place in the grand celestial hierarchy, which, in a monarchy obsessed with legitimacy and divine right, was a terrifying thing to consider. One reason this mystery still unnerves modern scholars is that we have no biological samples, no preserved tissues, no confirmed burial sites tied to named victims. We can't test for DNA, can't isolate a pathogen, can't trace a genomic signature. It is a blank spot in our scientific history, a phantom. And in an age of global pandemics and mutating viruses, the idea that a disease could emerge, kill selectively, then disappear without a trace feels disturbingly relevant. It happened once. It could happen again. And the next time it might not wait 500 years to reintroduce itself. The sweating sickness didn't just kill, it altered behavior. It changed travel plans. It disrupted successions. It scattered courts. It widened the gap between monarch and subject. And it made clear, in a way that few events could, that even kings could sweat. Because for all their crowns and courts and canopies, Tudor monarchs were just as vulnerable to a microscopic mystery as the butcher's son or the tavern girl. Illness didn't read titles. It read bloodstreams. And as we move forward in royal history, one mystery leads naturally to another. Because what happens when that royal bloodstream begins to collapse from within? When the king himself, a boy bred for power and shaped by evangelical reformers, begins to wither under a disease no one can diagnose in time. Next, we turn to the tragedy of Edward VI, the boy king whose brief reign carried the weight of a religious revolution and whose death may have been as misunderstood as the movement he inherited. 24. Edward VI's final illness. What exactly took the boy king? The Tudor dynasty was not built to last. It was built to survive. And when Edward VI inherited the throne at just 9 years old, that fragile survival suddenly had the voice of a coughing child. Edward was the longed-for son of Henry VIII, the prize for which wives were cast aside, kingdoms split from Rome, and monasteries reduced to rubble. His very existence was supposed to solve everything. But instead, his brief, turbulent reign became the last fragile bridge between religious reform and royal blood. And then he died, quietly, slowly, mysteriously. We know when, July 6, 1553. We know where, the royal palace at Greenwich. We even know what was said in the final days, whispers of Protestant fervor, scribbled signatures on a contested document known as the Devise for the Succession. What we don't know, even now, is what exactly killed him. Strangely enough, Edward wasn't always thought of as a frail child. In his early years, he was described as intelligent, active, and even robust. His education was rigorous, his tutors elite, and his Protestant faith deeply ingrained. He wrote with sharp political awareness and argued with theological precision. For a boy growing up in the shadow of a famously oversized father, Edward carried his role with a quiet kind of gravity. But sometime around early 1553, something began to go wrong. His health started to deteriorate. Reports from court spoke of weight loss, weakness, and a persistent, hacking cough. He could no longer walk without support. By spring, it was clear to everyone around him that Edward was dying, but no one could agree on why, which is where the real mystery begins. Modern historians and medical experts have retroactively tried to diagnose Edward's illness using the limited reports from the time, notes from courtiers, physicians, and diplomatic correspondence. Their conclusions fall into three main camps. Tuberculosis. This is the most widely accepted theory. The symptoms, coughing, wasting, night sweats, fatigue, align with TB, which was a common and often fatal disease in Tudor England. It's possible Edward had latent tuberculosis that became active during his teen years. Chronic lung infection or immune condition. Some argue that Edward may have had a chronic respiratory illness, perhaps complicated by poor Tudor medical treatment or secondary infections. Others point to an autoimmune disease like sarcoidosis, though these are far harder to diagnose in hindsight. Medical mismanagement. A less biological and more political theory holds that Edward's death was hastened, or at least poorly managed, by the treatments he received. Tudor medicine, after all, was a blend of guesswork and superstition, involving bleeding, purging, and herbal concoctions of highly questionable efficacy. Unfortunately, no autopsy was performed. No tissue samples were preserved. All we have are written descriptions filtered through the language of the time, terms like consumption, decline, and distemper of the humors. These aren't diagnoses, they're interpretations, and they leave us in the dark. Of course, Edward's illness wasn't just a medical crisis. It was a political emergency. His death would mean the end of a Protestant male succession, something his closest advisors were desperate to prevent. So even as Edward lay wasting in bed, the gears of regime planning kept turning. In his final weeks, he was persuaded, or persuaded himself, to write the devise for the succession, naming Lady Jane Grey, a Protestant cousin, as his heir over his half-sisters Mary and Elizabeth. This was not merely a theological preference. It was a political maneuver designed to lock out Catholicism and cement the Reformation. But it also meant that Edward's death came under even more scrutiny. Did someone have reason to hasten it? Did factional politics contribute to his decline? There's no hard evidence of foul play. No whispered poisonings, no confessions. But the environment of urgency, the manipulation of a dying boy's signature, and the total collapse of the succession plan just 9 days after his death all contribute to a lingering unease. If Edward had lived, even a few more years, the entire trajectory of English religion and monarchy might have shifted. Instead, he became the boy king who died before the Reformation could settle. Edward's death ushered in one of the most chaotic episodes in Tudor history. Lady Jane Grey was declared queen, only to be replaced by Mary I within weeks. Protestantism was rolled back. Executions followed. Jane herself was beheaded, and England lurched into a new phase of religious anxiety, all because one teenage king died too soon, or perhaps more accurately, because he died without explanation. His death left a void not just in power, but in understanding. It became a footnote in a dynastic crisis, a tragic plot twist, a line in a succession document. But the mystery remains. What exactly took him? And what if the cause had been known, treatable, avoidable, or preventable? Would that have spared Jane? Would it have delayed Mary's reign? Would Elizabeth have ever taken the throne? In the absence of diagnosis, all we have is consequence. And speaking of consequences and lost truths, let's travel ahead to the 19th century, when the monarchy no longer needed swords or signatures to control succession, just a good editor. Because our next mystery is about what was removed, not what was recorded. 25. Victorian-era royal suppressed papers. What did the court choose not to preserve? By the 1800s, the British monarchy had evolved from divine right to constitutional institution. It no longer ruled by decree or decapitation. It ruled by narrative. And nowhere is that more obvious than in the story of the suppressed royal archives of the Victorian era. The 19th century was an age of paper. It was also an age of paper trails, letters, journals, telegrams, diaries, memos, notes scribbled in the margins. everything could be written down. And for the royals, everything was written down, which made discretion a full-time job. You see, when monarchs moved from wielding absolute power to performing respectability, the stakes didn't go down. They simply changed shape. Scandal wasn't just embarrassing, it was destabilizing. And in this new age of public opinion and newspapers, perception became everything. So the question became not what the royals did, but what the public was allowed to remember. The royal archives during the Victorian and early Edwardian periods were vast, private, and selectively curated. Letters were screened. Diaries were edited. Volumes of correspondence were published, but only in part. Some papers were lost. Others were quietly destroyed. And the justifications were always the same: privacy, propriety, the public good. But what exactly was being hidden? The answer lies in three key areas: relationships, health, and scandal. One of the most well-known and still controversial suppression efforts involved Queen Victoria's own letters, especially those concerning her relationship with John Brown, the Scottish servant who became her close confidant after Prince Albert's death. The depth of their relationship remains unknown, and that's not an accident. After Victoria's death, her youngest daughter, Princess Beatrice, was tasked with editing the Queen's journals. Beatrice rewrote them by hand, removing or softening passages deemed inappropriate or too revealing. The originals, mostly destroyed. What remains is a curated version of a life, rewritten by someone whose job was not to preserve truth, but to protect legacy. Another realm of suppression was medical. In a monarchy that claimed divine endorsement, illness could not be weakness. Royal conditions were often downplayed, misrepresented, or omitted entirely. Take George III, whose mental health struggles were framed as temporary delusions, or Edward VII, whose final illness was disguised for weeks to preserve appearances. Even Prince Albert's death was reported with strategic vagueness. Doctors weren't just medical advisors, they were PR managers. The message was simple: the body of the monarch must not appear fragile. Not to Parliament, not to the press, not to the people, and certainly not to historians. Finally, there's the matter of outright scandal, affairs, improprieties, and messy family disputes. Some involved minor royals, some involved very senior figures, and while some gossip escaped through whispers, through tabloid leaks, much of it never made it past the palace gates. Documents that could confirm or deny explosive rumors simply aren't there. Did they never exist? Or were they quietly removed? No one knows. And that's the point. This mystery isn't built on contradiction. It's built on omission. There is no false account to debunk, no lie to unravel. There's just the growing awareness that key materials are gone. They weren't lost in fires. They weren't stolen by foreign powers. They were removed by design, by people whose job was to protect the royal image, even at the cost of the historical record. And in many cases, we don't even know what we're missing, which makes it the perfect royal mystery. Because unlike a scandal that explodes, this one is vacuum sealed. No noise, no trace. Just a locked room in the archive, or worse, a burned one. And when mystery becomes institutional policy, you're no longer chasing facts. You're chasing ghosts. And those ghosts still whisper through the remaining pages, the redacted letters, the careful ellipses of the official record. And with that, we close our tour of 25 mysteries, not with a discovery, but with a quiet question. What else have we been told to forget?